Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into a world where the wind tastes of salt and ice, where the stars glitter like shards of glass scattered across a black sky, and where survival itself feels like a daily act of defiance. We're heading into the story of the Inuit, the people of the Arctic, whose ancestors crossed unimaginable distances, whose ingenuity carved homes out of snow and boats out of skin, and whose stories are woven as tightly as a sealskin parka. If you're new here, remember to like this video, subscribe for more sleepy history journeys, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fun to see the global campfire of listeners scattered across time zones, but gathered here together. Now, let's step onto the snow. Close your eyes if you like, and imagine the crunch beneath your boots. The night sky above is alive with auroras, green curtains rippling in silence, as though the heavens themselves are telling you a story. The air is so cold it bites your teeth, but also so sharp and clean that each breath feels like drinking from a spring. Somewhere ahead, the faint glow of an oil lamp trembles against the wind, a little pocket of warmth in an ocean of darkness. This is where our story begins. Long before anyone called them Inuit, long before Europeans dreamed of the Northwest Passage or whalers plied the icy waters, people were already pushing into these frozen margins of the world. Their journey began thousands of years ago on the far side of the Bering Strait in the windswept tundras of Siberia. Imagine small bands of hunters moving across landscapes where mammoth once roamed their belongings, light enough to be carried on their backs, their eyes trained on the snow for the faintest tracks of caribou or muskox. At some point, archaeologists estimate 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, these people stepped onto the natural bridge of land and ice that once connected Asia and North America. That crossing Beringia was less a single road than a vast shifting plain of tundra marsh and ice flows. Crossing into Alaska wasn't a single grand migration, the kind you picture in a movie, with entire tribes marching in a line of torches. It was quieter. Families moved, following game settling for seasons, sometimes returning, sometimes pressing forward. Little by little footsteps added up to millennia of movement, and gradually the Arctic's human story unfolded. The first confirmed human presence in what we call the High Arctic is linked to a tradition archaeologists romantically named the Arctic Small Tool Tradition. It's a plain title, but what it hides is extraordinary tiny blades, often no bigger than your thumb, sharp enough to slice hide, scrape bone, and shape wood. Tools so small they almost look like toys, yet they were the keys to survival. Imagine sitting inside a skin tent, the wind battering the walls, and in your hands you hold a scraper only a few centimeters long, shaping fur into something that will keep your family alive at minus 40 degrees. These people, often called the pre-Dorset, carried with them a minimalist genius, packing survival into the smallest possible package. And their world was anything but forgiving. Picture it, the endless tundra winds that seem to peel the skin from your face, days that shrink into hours of dim twilight. At sites like Independence Eye in Greenland, archaeologists have uncovered circles of stones, tent rings, that once held down hide shelters against these winds. The people who lived there hunted muskox, caribou, and seals. To us it seems fragile, perilous. To them, it was life, and life was enough. We know these early Arctic peoples didn't arrive from nowhere. Modern DNA traces threads back to Siberian populations, relatives of the Chukchi and other northeastern peoples. The echoes are even in language where Inuit tongues today carry faint kinship with words spoken across the strait. Imagine carrying your grandmother's lullabies across an ocean of ice, the sounds evolving, but never breaking until centuries later they're sung in an entirely new land. But let's not romanticize it too much. These migrations weren't storybook adventures. They were desperate calculations of survival. Every decision mattered. Do you risk staying longer in a camp when food is scarce? Or do you push ahead across dangerous ice, hoping the seals are plentiful there? A single mistake could end not just your hunt, but your entire lineage. Yet somehow, they didn't just endure. They adapted refined and passed on knowledge. Every generation added another line to the manual of Arctic survival, a manual not written on paper, but carved into habits, rituals, and stories. Think about the knowledge it would take, knowing which way caribou would turn if startled, reading the wind's ripple across snow to predict storms, listening to the breathing of seals beneath the ice. Knowledge like this isn't written down. It's embodied, taught from hand to hand, whispered in the ear of a child while walking across a frozen bay. Imagine being 6 years old, watching your father crouch by a seal hole, holding a harpoon for hours without moving, teaching you the patience of stone. That child grows up, teaches their own children, and so the knowledge flows. As night deepens, imagine a small camp. A ring of stones holds down a tent made of caribou hides. Inside, light flickers from a soapstone lamp fueled with seal oil, the only flame for miles. The warmth is meager, but it turns the air soft enough to breathe. A mother scrapes skins, while humming children watch wide-eyed, and an elder tells a story, a tale about animals that once spoke about spirits that live in the snow. Outside, the Arctic wind howls uncaring. Inside, people laugh. Somehow, against all odds, they feel safe. This is the paradox of the Inuit story. From the outside, the Arctic looks like a hostile wasteland, a place where no one should live. But from within, once you learn the rhythms, it becomes a home. The land is alive with resources, seal holes, fish under ice berries, and the short summer caribou migrations in autumn. The world is harsh, but not barren. It rewards those who know its secrets. And slowly, across centuries, the ancestors of the Inuit unlock them one by one. The chapter of humanity that begins here is one of patience, precision, and balance. Unlike other civilizations that rose with plows and cities, the Inuit civilization rose with sled runners and harpoons. It's not a story of conquering the land, but negotiating with it humbly, cautiously, but persistently. And this delicate dance of survival would eventually blossom into one of the most unique and enduring cultures on Earth. As we leave tonight's first step on this journey, picture the Arctic night again. The snow stretches into infinity, auroras twist above and beneath your feet lies the frozen memory of every migration, every campfire, every whispered story. The Inuit story has begun not with fanfare, but with footsteps crunching over ancient ice. When you picture survival in the Arctic, maybe you imagine thick fur parkas, massive sleds pulled by howling dogs, or hunters in sleek kayaks slicing through icy seas. But the earliest known people of this world, the pre-Dorset, also called the Arctic small tool tradition, didn't yet have those things. What they had were stones, bones, and patience. It's a story of making a civilization out of crumbs of carving endurance, out of pebbles, Let's start with their toolkit. Archaeologists call it the small tool tradition for good reason. Their knives, scrapers, and blades were often no bigger than a paperclip. If you ever misplace your phone charger and think, how am I supposed to live without it? Imagine trying to butcher a caribou with something the size of your thumbnail. Yet these microblades were razor sharp, chipped with precision, and fitted into handles of bone or antler. They could slice hides, shape wood drill holes, and prepare food. Their genius was not in brute strength, but in careful efficiency. When resources are scarce, when every scrap of driftwood, every shard of stone, every piece of antler matters, you don't waste. You miniaturize. You refine. Picture one of these families around 2000 BCE. A man crouches inside a skin tent, holding a sliver of stone between thumb and forefinger. With tiny flicks of a hammerstone, he shapes it into a blade so sharp it could shave hair. Beside him, a woman uses a similar tool to scrape a caribou hide until it's soft and pliable enough to stitch into boots. Around them, children play with bone toys, imitating the motions of their elders, turning work into practice into tradition. This was not just survival. It was craftsmanship, honed in the teeth of scarcity. Their camps were small, temporary, and strategically placed. Archaeologists have found the remains of tent rings, circular arrangements of stones that once pinned down the edges of skin tents against Arctic winds. The image is haunting circles of rock still sitting on tundra, thousands of years later. The tents long gone, the families gone, but the shape of their homes frozen in place. Independence. A site in northern Greenland tells us about these camps. Imagine arriving there today, a wide treeless expanse, nothing but rock, moss, and wind. Then you notice the stones set just so. Suddenly, you realize this bleak place was once a neighborhood. Here people cooked, laughed, whispered stories. It's like seeing a footprint fossilized in stone. It makes the past feel immediate, as if someone just left a moment ago. The pre-Dorset hunted whatever the land would give them: muskox, caribou, sealfish. Each animal required not just bravery, but a mental library of strategies. For caribou, you might build blinds near migration routes, waiting motionless for hours. For muskox, you had to understand their defense circles and exploit gaps. For seals, patience was the ultimate weapon. Hunters would locate breathing holes in the ice, sometimes finding them by subtle signs like frost rings or stray whiskers caught in the snow. Then they'd crouch in silence, harpoon in hand, for hours unmoving. If you've ever tried to sit perfectly still while your leg falls asleep, multiply that discomfort by -30 degrees, and add the possibility that failure means your family goes hungry. This was survival as meditation, and here's the astonishing thing: their methods worked. They didn't just scrape by. They built a way of life that lasted nearly 2 millennia. 2,000 years of small camps, small tools, and enormous resilience. Of course, they weren't isolated ghosts wandering the ice. Modern genetic studies show that these people carried DNA markers linking them to populations across Siberia. Their bloodlines, their languages, their spiritual ideas had roots stretching back across the strait. The ancestors of the Inuit are not a mystery people who appeared out of nowhere. They were part of a vast northern tapestry of Chukchi Yupik and other Arctic groups, all experimenting with survival in cold climates. Imagine voices echoing across Beringia, different tongues, but similar songs, cousins separated by oceans of ice. Their tools also tell us something subtle, an aesthetic of precision. To make a microblade that small and sharp, you need steady hands, patience, and an eye for detail. This wasn't sloppy work hammered out in desperation. It was careful, almost artistic. Each piece suggests a culture where skill was admired, where mastery of craft was as essential as bravery in the hunt. Think about it. In most places, the great monuments of ancient peoples are stone temples, pyramids, palaces. Here the monuments are tiny shards of flint, so delicate you could miss them under a boot heel. But in their smallness, they speak volumes. They show us that survival in the Arctic wasn't about size or spectacle. It was about exactness, about getting things just right. Let's pause to think of the children. Picture a child, maybe 8 years old, tasked with carrying stones from a riverbed back to camp. Each stone is tested by an elder's hand, too brittle, too soft, too grainy. The right stone is kept, the rest tossed aside. The child watches, learns. Later, that same child will be taught to flake off a blade, to lash it into bone, to cut a strip of hide with it. Knowledge wasn't written, it was lived, absorbed, repeated. The child grows up, carries those habits forward, and so culture flows like an underground river, invisible but constant. But the pre-Dorset weren't just practical. There are whispers of their spiritual life, too hinted at in carvings and artifacts. Some of their harpoons were etched with designs small but deliberate. Why decorate a hunting tool? Maybe it was functional grip enhancing. Maybe it was spiritual, a way of respecting the animal's spirit, reminding the hunter that every kill was a negotiation, not a conquest. In Arctic belief systems that would follow animals, had souls, Inuit, and success in the hunt depended on treating them with respect. It's not hard to imagine these early people already sensing that truth, that survival here required more than skill. It required reverence. And yet, as ingenious as they were, the pre-Dorset were not the final word in Arctic culture. Around 500 BCE, their ways began to fade, replaced by something new, the Dorset remembered later in Inuit lore as the Tunit. But that comes later. For now, imagine the last generations of pre-Dorset hunters still sharpening microliths, still crouching by seal holes, still building rings of stone against the wind. They didn't know they were the pre-anything. They didn't know they were stepping stones in history. They were simply living, surviving, raising children, watching auroras, and telling stories as the snow fell. What lingers from their time is not just their tools, but their quiet persistence. The Arctic did not crush them. It shaped them. And their legacy, tiny though it may look in a museum case, was vast. They proved that the high Arctic, that realm of eternal night and ice, could be inhabited, mapped, understood, and even loved. Without them, there would be no Inuit, no drum songs under northern lights, no kayaks slicing through waves. They laid the fragile but unbreakable foundation. So next time you hold something small, a key, a coin, a pebble, remember once a people armed with nothing larger than that carved out 2,000 years of life on the edge of the world. And that was only the beginning. By about 500 BCE, the Arctic was ready for its next act. The pre-Dorset, with their pebble-sized blades and fragile tent rings, slowly gave way to a new people, larger in presence, stronger in adaptation, and remembered centuries later in Inuit lore as the Tunit. The name carries a whisper of myth. Ask an elder about the Tunit, and you might hear that they were giants, gentle but powerful, who could lift huge stones, yet somehow faded into the snow when the Inuit arrived. History and memory blur here, as they often do. But behind the legend lies an extraordinary culture, the Dorset. The Dorset were innovators. If the pre-Dorset were survivalists, chiseling sharpness out of scarcity, the Dorset were architects and engineers of the Arctic. They built semi-subterranean homes, insulated against cold winds, dug down into the earth, and sealed with stone turf and skins. These weren't flimsy seasonal tents. Some had elaborate ventilation shafts to carry away smoke and condensation drainage systems to prevent flooding, and lamp niches carved into stone slabs. Step inside one of these houses on a winter night, the lamp glowing with seal oil, the walls muffled against the howl of the storm, and you might find it warmer than some modern cabins. And speaking of lamps, picture a soapstone bowl, shallow carved with care. Into it, they poured seal oil. A carefully trimmed moss wick burned with steady flame, casting golden light on the room. This was the Dorset's hearth, their fireplace, and lantern in one. Imagine winter stretching into months of darkness, and a family gathered around that little flame. Outside, the world is frozen silence. Inside, you can read expressions, sew clothing, tell stories, and feel that elusive thing called home. The Dorset also refined hunting. They perfected the toggling harpoon, a weapon so clever it deserves a moment of admiration. When it struck an animal, say a seal, the head would turn sideways under the skin, anchoring securely, so the prey couldn't wriggle free. It's a design engineers would applaud, today simple, devastatingly effective, and born entirely from careful observation. Their ice fishing gear was just as advanced, multi-pronged spears, lures carved to imitate fish hooks that could catch Arctic char through holes in the ice. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving by mastering every angle of the environment. And then there were the boats. The Dorset are credited with the first true kayaks and umiaks in the Arctic. Think about that leap from foot travel across the tundra to sliding across open seas in vessels built from driftwood and animal skins. The kayak, small and sleek, became an extension of the human body, paddler and boat, moving as one across icy swells. The umiak, larger and more communal, carried families, cargo, and hunting parties. Suddenly, marine life wasn't just within reach, it was accessible in numbers, large enough to sustain whole communities. Bowhead whales, walruses, seals, creatures bigger than a dozen men, could now be hunted with coordination and confidence. But the Dorset weren't only practical, they were artists and visionaries. Archaeologists have uncovered ivory figurines carved with such delicate detail you'd think they belonged in a Renaissance workshop. Polar bears with muscles, rippling seals, mid-swim, human-animal hybrids caught in moments of transformation. These weren't idle doodles. They reveal a spiritual worldview where the line between human and animal was porous fluid. To hunt a seal was to engage with its spirit, to honor it, to negotiate. To carve its likeness was to remember the balance between worlds. Some figurines show half-human, half-animal beings, shamans, shifting shape, bridging realms. Imagine these carvings, held in cold hands, carried as amulets, tokens of protection, or spiritual passports for journeys into the unseen. Their spirituality wasn't abstract. It was woven into daily routines, into taboos and rituals. Hunters observed strict codes about how to treat animals, which bones to return to the sea, which skins to honor. To disrespect the Inuit, the spirit of a creature, was to invite misfortune. It's a worldview that makes sense in a place where a single hunt could mean life or death for dozens of people. If animals had souls, then each hunt was a sacred transaction. Treat the seal well, and its kin might return. Treat it poorly, and the ice might be silent next year. And so the Dorset created not just a technology, but an ethic, an entire philosophy of coexistence with a landscape that most outsiders would call merciless. It was merciless, yes, but also alive, generous, and fair if treated with respect. We might imagine Dorset life as cold and lonely, but the archaeological record hints otherwise. Sites show groupings of houses, clusters, not isolated tents. These were communities, extended families, perhaps seasonal gatherings of several bands. People came together to hunt, share, celebrate. Picture the rhythmic beat of drums' voices rising in song, children playing in the snow outside while elders swap stories inside. The Arctic night is long, but laughter carries far across the ice. Yet for all their ingenuity, the Dorset remain something of a mystery. Unlike the later Thule ancestors of the Inuit, the Dorset left behind no kayaks preserved in ice, no written records, no clear descendants. Their genetic signature fades out. Their stories survive only in fragments, retold by those who came after. To the Inuit, the Tunit were remembered as strong but shy, retreating into the wilderness when confronted. It's possible that the Dorset and Inuit coexisted for centuries in some places, trading, intermarrying, maybe even sharing knowledge. But the overall arc is clear. The Dorset faded, the Inuit endured. Why did they vanish? Climate shifts, dwindling resources, the arrival of new technologies historians debate. The medieval warming period, which began around 900 CE, melted some ice, changed migration patterns, and may have undermined the Dorset strategies. Meanwhile, the incoming Thule brought innovations in whaling sled dogs and large-scale cooperation. Against that tide, the Dorset couldn't compete. But before they slipped into shadow, the Dorset left a legacy. Their houses taught future peoples new ways of building. Their harpoons influenced Inuit designs. Their spirituality, fluid animal-centered reverent echoes still in Inuit stories. And their carvings, tiny enough to fit in a palm, carry forward the sense that even in the coldest places, humans dream, imagine, and seek beauty. Think of it this way. If the pre-Dorset carved survival into stone shards, the Dorset carved identity into ivory. They took the raw Arctic and turned it into meaning community art. And though they vanished, they live on as the giants of Inuit memory, larger than life, half human, half myth, walking the snow somewhere just beyond sight. So as the wind howls outside that Dorset house, as the lamp flame trembles in its stone bowl, picture the shadow of a hunter at work. His harpoon is ready, his spirit helpers at his side. He steps into the night, leaving behind a community that knows no word for defeat, only adaptation, only continuity. The Tunit are fading into legend, but their story is far from over. Because from the west, a new tide is rising. A people with sled dogs, whaleboats, and languages that still sing today. The Thule are coming, and with them, the ancestors of the Inuit. Imagine waking in a house made of snow. The walls curve inward blocks stacked in a spiral that locks itself tight like the shell of a nautilus. There is no door, only a low tunnel you crawl through, and when you stand up inside, the air is warmer than you'd expect, quiet muffled a hush, like the inside of an ear. Outside, the storm lashes the tundra snow, racing sideways ice pellets sharp as needles. But inside, the lamp flickers, children play, and the world feels safe. This is the genius of Arctic architecture, and in the Dorset and later Thule worlds, it reached astonishing levels of ingenuity. Snow houses, what we casually call igloos, were not just emergency shelters. They were temporary homes, engineered with precision. Not every snow will do. The blocks must be cut from hard-packed drifts, dense enough to hold a blade's edge, yet light enough to lift. Builders used long knives made of bone antler, or later metal, to slice out blocks tilting each at an angle so the spiral leaned inward. With each placement, the dome closed tighter until only a small circle of sky remained. The final block set from the inside sealed the home like a lid on a jar. Step inside such a snow house, and the first thing you notice is the silence. The wind dies. The noise of the storm becomes a distant hum. Light seeps through the semi-translucent walls, pale blue, by day glowing softly at night. Inside, the temperature might rise above freezing, which in the Arctic feels like luxury. Beds were carved from packed snow, layered with skins. A single soapstone lamp could heat the space, keep water, liquid cook food, and provide light for long nights. You couldn't live in an igloo forever. But for hunters far from home or families traveling across winter landscapes, it was a masterpiece of design, efficient, portable, and perfectly adapted. But the Dorset, and later the Thule, weren't content with temporary domes. They built permanent winter houses, half sunk into the ground, insulated with stone turf and sod. Some were covered with whalebones ribs and jawbones arching into frames, the skeletal remains of giants turned into shelter. Whalebone villages still leave traces on Arctic coasts, massive arches of bone poking from tundra, silent monuments to both ingenuity and cooperation. Picture one of these houses in its prime. The walls are made of sod blocks, layered thick, the roof supported by driftwood poles, or the rib bones of a bowhead whale. The entrance is a tunnel dug low, so cold air settles there, while warm air rises into the living space. Inside, platforms of stone or wood hold bedding. Seal oil lamps glow from carved niches. In one corner, tools are spread for repair harpoon heads, bone needle scrapers. In another, skins are stretched for sewing. Children huddle around grandparents, hearing stories of animal spirits and heroes. The air smells of oil hides and snow, strange but comforting. Some of these houses were vast, able to host multiple families, workshops, and storage. Archaeologists have found remains over 10 meters long with space for 30 people. Imagine a whole community wintering inside such a structure, moving through tunnels, hearing the constant creak of bones in the wind, a sound that must have been both eerie and reassuring. If you've ever sat inside a cathedral and felt the weight of stone above, think of that same awe. But here, the ceiling is made of the bones of whales, creatures once hunted with courage and coordination. The architecture itself is a reminder of survival. These walls exist because we mastered the sea. The Dorset perfected these semi-subterranean homes, and the Thule later refined them. The Thule, with their bowhead whaling expertise, built entire villages around whalebone houses. Communities clustered along coasts, where whales passed reliably, the houses aligned to face the sea as if waiting. Imagine the sight from a distance, rows of sod-covered domes, jawbones jutting up like gateways, smoke rising faintly from lamp vents, dogs tethered outside kayaks pulled onto racks. In the dark winter, the whole village glows faintly, each lamp a beacon. Architecture here wasn't just about survival. It was about philosophy. Every design mirrored the Arctic's lessons: conserve heat, minimize waste use what is available. A whale was never just food. It was house lamp rope, sled runner tool, and story. Nothing was discarded, not even bones. In a way, the villages themselves were a dialogue between humans and animals, a permanent acknowledgement that survival was shared. The hunter kills the whale, but the whale's body keeps the hunter's family alive through winter. The bones become walls that guard children from blizzards. It's not difficult to imagine why spiritual beliefs grew around reciprocity and respect. Every wall reminded you of what you owed. Snow houses and whalebone homes also shaped community life. Seasonal rhythms meant families dispersed in summer, traveling for caribou or fish. But in winter, they clustered together, house beside house. These winter villages were the crucible of culture. Nights were long, so people told stories, drummed, sang invented games. Knowledge was exchanged alliances, built marriages arranged. The houses weren't just shelters. They were stages for the performance of identity. And yes, humor survived here too. Imagine being snowed in for weeks. You'd need laughter. Archaeologists can't dig up jokes, but oral traditions tell us Inuit and their ancestors loved riddles, teasing songs, playful competitions. A snow house wasn't a grim fortress. It was full of life, the walls echoing with giggles, lullabies, and the occasional argument over who gets the warmest spot. Of course, the architecture also carried danger. Oil lamps could suffocate a household if ventilation wasn't perfect. Roofs might collapse under heavy snow. But these risks were calculated, managed, part of the skill. A successful house was proof of mastery, as much a test of knowledge as the hunt itself. When Europeans eventually encountered these structures, many were astonished. To outsiders, the Arctic was a blank void, a place fit only for suffering. But then they stepped into a whalebone house or a snow hut and found warmth, order, and resilience. Some even admitted grudgingly that Inuit homes were better suited to the Arctic than European cabins. It's an irony, the so-called primitive dwellings of Inuit ancestors were in fact engineering marvels, fine-tuned over centuries of trial and error. As the Dorset faded and the Thule surged across the Arctic around 900 CE, these architectural traditions blended and expanded. The Thule masters of dog sleds and whale hunting made villages permanent and populous. But their foundations rested on what came before the Dorset lamp, the Dorset snow house, the Dorset ethic of adaptation. Tonight, as you lie under your own roof, plaster brick, maybe wood, imagine trading it for snow. Imagine sleeping under the curve of a dome, the air warm from a lamp, the silence profound. Or picture yourself inside a whalebone hall, the ribs of a leviathan creaking overhead, your family clustered close, the world outside a frozen void. Would it feel claustrophobic or strangely comforting? Maybe both. What matters is this: these houses, whether made of snow or bone, were not just shelters. They were declarations. They said, we can live here. We can not only survive, but make a home, make a life, make a culture. And that declaration echoed so powerfully that it still rings today every time someone looks at an igloo and feels a flash of wonder. From stone rings to snow blocks to whalebone villages, Arctic architecture tells a story of brilliance carved against the odds. And it prepared the stage for what comes next, the great migration of the Thule, the people who would become the ancestors of the Inuit. With sleds, kayaks, and whaleboats, they would sweep eastward and change the Arctic forever. Imagine standing on a cliff edge in western Alaska 1,000 years ago. The sea is dotted with ice floes. Gulls wheel overhead, and far out on the horizon, a plume of spray rises the exhale of a bowhead whale, one of the largest creatures on Earth. To most people, such a sight would inspire awe, tinged with fear. But to the Thule, the ancestors of today's Inuit, it was an opportunity. They had mastered the art of hunting whales, and with that mastery came the power to move to expand and to transform the Arctic itself. The Thule migration, beginning around 900 CE, is one of the most astonishing expansions in human history. Within just a few centuries, they swept from Alaska all the way to Greenland, more than 5,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline. Think about that. While medieval kings in Europe were fussing over castles and crusades, the Thule were building an empire of ice and sea, powered not by armies, but by teamwork tools and whales. Their secret weapon was technology. Where the Dorset had lived in small, scattered communities, the Thule arrived with innovations that changed the game. First, there was the umiak, a massive open boat made of a driftwood or whalebone frame stretched with seal or walrus skins. These weren't little kayaks for solitary hunters. These were ships of the north, capable of carrying crews of a dozen or more. Picture one skimming across icy water, the paddlers moving in rhythm, harpoons ready. With these boats, the Thule could chase bowhead whales weighing over 100 tons. Catch just one, and your entire community had food, fuel, and materials for months. The hunt itself was dangerous theater. A crew would launch in their umiak, the boat heaving over swells, paddlers' breaths clouding in the air. At the bow, the harpooner crouched, waiting for the moment the whale surfaced. The strike had to be perfect. The toggling harpoon sinking deep, the line snaking out as the whale sounded, dragging the boat in what whalers later called a Nantucket sleigh ride. Imagine clinging to a skin boat as a whale pulls you across the sea like a runaway horse, the spray in your face, the boat threatening to splinter. Eventually, exhausted, the whale would surface again and the crew would strike again until the giant slowed. Then came the hauling, the butchering, the dividing, a ritual as much as a practical act. From these hunts came not just food, but architecture. The bones of bowhead whales were so massive that they could be used as structural beams. Archaeologists have uncovered entire houses framed by jawbones and ribs, the spaces between filled with sod and turf. Walking into one must have felt like stepping into the ribcage of the whale itself, as if the creature had become both meal and home. It's not hard to see why the Thul's descendants spoke of whales with reverence as beings that offered themselves to sustain humans. The Thul also brought dogs. Not just any dogs, these were specialized sled dogs, bred for strength, endurance, and loyalty. Harnessed together, they pulled sleds across ice fields, carrying people, meat, and supplies over distances that would exhaust human legs. The sleds themselves were marvels of engineering lashed with rawhide that allowed flexibility over rough ice. Travel that once took days could now be accomplished in hours. And perhaps more importantly, sled dogs provided companionship, a bond of trust between species that still endures in the Arctic today. Then there was their housing. The Thul took the semi-subterranean house and refined it. Their homes had long entrance tunnels to trap cold air drainage systems to keep melting ice from flooding the floor, and dedicated work areas for sewing, tool making, and storage. Families lived not in isolation, but in clusters of such houses, forming villages where cooperation was the default. After all, you can't hunt a bowhead whale alone. You need your neighbors, your cousins, your in-laws, everyone pulling together. This spirit of cooperation extended beyond single communities. The Thule created vast trade networks stretching across thousands of kilometers. Copper from the central Canadian Arctic meteoric iron, from Greenland soapstone from quarries. These materials moved hand to hand, village to village. Imagine an ivory carving made in one community being traded hundreds of miles away, its story carried along with it. These weren't isolated groups, huddled in survival. They were nodes in a web of connection spanning the entire Arctic. Their knowledge system was equally advanced. To live in the Arctic is to read the world with microscopic attention, the angle of wind-carved snow, the color of ice, the call of seabirds. The Thule inherited this from their ancestors and expanded it, passing knowledge orally from generation to generation. They could predict storms by the shape of clouds, track animals by the faintest signs, and navigate featureless tundra by stars and memory. Their language itself was packed with precision. Where we might say ice, they had dozens of terms for thin ice, thick ice, rotten ice, drifting ice, ice safe, to cross ice ready to break. Words became maps survival encoded in syllables. Climate played a part in their rise. The medieval warming period, which lasted roughly from 900 to 1300 CE, thinned the ice in many regions, making whale hunting easier and new territories accessible. The Dorset, who had thrived on thick ice and seal hunting, found their strategies less reliable. The Thule, with their boats and dogs and networks, flourished in the change. It was timing as much as technology, the right people with the right tools at the right environmental moment. And as they expanded eastward into Canada and Greenland, the Thule became the direct ancestors of today's Inuit. Genetic studies confirm the continuity. You can trace a line from those whaling crews in Alaska a millennium ago to Inuit families across the Arctic today. The language continuity is even more striking. Across thousands of kilometers, Inuit dialects remain mutually intelligible, a testament to how recently and rapidly this expansion occurred. But history is rarely simple. In some places, the Thule encountered the Dorset. Archaeological sites show mixed layers, Dorset tools beside Thule harpoons. Perhaps they traded shared techniques intermarried. Perhaps there was tension. The oral traditions that remember the Tunit as strong but timid may echo these encounters. What's clear is that over time, the Thule way of life prevailed. By around 1500 CE, the Dorset were gone, and the Inuit world was firmly established. The Thule expansion was not empire in the European sense. There were no kings, no palaces, no armies marching under banners. Instead, it was empire by resilience, by knowledge, by technology. It was a civilization of snow houses, and umiaks of dogs, and stars of lamps burning in the darkness. And unlike so many empires that rose and fell in fire and blood, this one lasted because it adapted, because it flowed with the environment rather than fought against it. So imagine again that moment on the Alaskan coast. The whale spouts the umiak surges forward. The harpooner raises his arm. In that instant lies the power of a people who would cross an entire continent, who would transform the Arctic from a frontier into a homeland. The Great Migration is underway, and the Inuit story still unfolding today takes its fullest shape. By the time the Thule hunters pushed east into Greenland around the year 1200, the island already carried the footprints of another strange people. The Norse had arrived centuries earlier, led by Eric the Red, carving their sheep pastures and stone churches into the southwestern coast. Imagine that contrast on one side, Europeans in wool cloaks tending cattle in turf houses that looked a bit like sod-covered hobbit holes. On the other side, Inuit ancestors in fur parkas riding sleek kayaks, their sled dogs howling at the edge of the sea ice. Two worlds that seemed to belong in different storybooks found themselves neighbors. The first encounters were probably cautious. Archaeologists digging at places like Ruin Island in northwest Greenland have found Norse objects among Thule tools and Inuit harpoon heads in Norse farmstead sites. That tells us they met, they traded, and they learned from each other, at least at times. The Inuit coveted iron, a knife blade, or an axe could replace hours of chipping stone. The Norse, meanwhile, valued walrus ivory and narwhal tusks, which could fetch fabulous prices back in Europe, sometimes sold as unicorn horns to gullible nobles who believed in their magical powers. It was an odd exchange, one side seeking survival tools, the other seeking status symbols. But not every encounter was friendly. The Norse sagas, those Icelandic tales of bravery and disaster, refer to people they called skraelings, a catch-all word for indigenous peoples of the Arctic and North America. Sometimes these stories describe trade, with furs swapped for weapons or milk. Sometimes they describe violence, arrows, loosed boats, overturned settlers driven away. It's hard to know how much of this is fact and how much saga embellishment. But it feels likely that the relationship was inconsistent, shifting with weather resources and mood. After all, if you're a Norse farmer with hungry sheep and a Greenland winter coming on, and across the fjord is a band of skilled hunters with fresh seal meat, things could get tense quickly. The Inuit, with their umiaks and kayaks, were perfectly adapted to Arctic seas. The Norse, with their square-sailed ships, were less nimble once the ice set in. Imagine a Norseman watching an Inuit hunter roll his kayak after capsizing, coming back up, with a flick of the paddle dripping but unharmed. To a farmer used to plowing fields, it must have looked like sorcery. But while the Norse had iron, the Inuit had knowledge. They read the ice, the snow, the animals in ways Europeans couldn't fathom. In this harsh place, knowledge usually beats technology. And as centuries passed, the balance shifted. The climate cooled again during what historians call the Little Ice Age. The Norse, who depended on grazing animals and farming, found their pastures shrinking under frost. Their trade with Europe faltered. Archaeological digs at Norse farms in Greenland show bones of cattle dwindling, replaced more and more by seal bones. They were sliding toward Inuit ways of survival, but without the same depth of skill. Meanwhile, the Thule-inherited Inuit were thriving hunting bowhead whales, building strong villages, their sled dogs ranging far across the ice. By the 1400s, the Norse colonies in Greenland collapsed. Whether they were pushed out by Inuit competition, undone by climate, or simply cut off from Europe, the result was the same. Their churches fell silent. Their farms abandoned, their turf houses left to sag into the earth. The last written record from the Norse Greenlanders comes from 1408, a wedding in a stone church at Valsey, one of the best preserved ruins in Greenland today. After that silence, the Inuit remained. It's tempting to tell this as a story of conquest Inuit, defeating Norse one culture, replacing another. But the truth was subtler. More likely, it was endurance versus fragility. The Norse clung to their European ways, sheep-cattle field strategies that worked in Iceland, but stumbled in Greenland's harsher climate. The Inuit were flexible, adapting, constantly shifting, with the ice following seals, whales, and caribou. When the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, it was the flexible who survived. Yet even in collapse, the Norse left gifts behind. The spread of iron among Inuit groups almost certainly came through contact, and oral traditions of the Inuit include faint echoes of these tall foreigners. Some stories remember encounters with powerful strangers. Others fold them into myth. It's possible that in the minds of Inuit storytellers, the memory of the Norse mingled with the older memories of the Dorset Tunit, forming a shadowy cast of vanished others who once walked the land. Giant Skraeling's Tunit. It's hard to untangle where history ends and folklore begins. What's more haunting is the idea that somewhere in the 1300s, a Norse farmer and an Inuit hunter might have stood across from each other on an icy shore, neither speaking the other's language, each carrying the weight of their people's survival. Maybe they traded, maybe they fought, maybe they simply stared, recognizing in the other both difference and similarity. Both knew what it was to depend on firelight against endless night, to wonder if the next hunt would feed their children. Different clothes, different gods, but the same cold wind biting their cheeks. When the Norse finally vanished, the Inuit inherited Greenland entire. The stone churches crumbled, but the whalebone villages glowed with lamplight. European visitors in later centuries would find only Inuit communities, expert sailors, hunters, and storytellers moving easily through landscapes that had broken the Norse. To them, Greenland was not a dead land at all, but a home. And yet Greenland's story wasn't finished, because centuries later, more Europeans would return, not wandering farmers this time, but whalers, missionaries, and traders backed by global empires. And this time, contact would be longer, deeper, and far more disruptive. But for now, in the 1400s, the balance belonged to the Inuit. Their dogs roamed the ridges, their kayaks slipped between icebergs, their drums echoed in the dark. The Norse were gone, but the people of the Arctic remained stronger than ever. Close your eyes and listen. A low whine rises in the distance, the kind only a dog with a thick coat and colder patience can make. Then the sudden sharp barks pause, thudding across ice, the creak of wooden runners on packed snow. This was the heartbeat of Inuit travel for centuries. The dog sled pulled by animals that were not pets in the modern sense, but partners bred for endurance, strength, and loyalty in the world's harshest terrain. The sled dog was no accident. The Thule ancestors of the Inuit refined breeding over generations until they had animals perfectly adapted to the Arctic. These weren't pampered house dogs. They were powerhouses with double coats, thick paws, and a metabolism that turned blubber into endless energy. Their bodies radiated survival, and their spirits, well, let's just say you needed both patience and authority to manage a team. Sled dogs had personalities stubborn, eager, sometimes aggressive, but always fierce workers once harnessed. Imagine 10 of them lashed in a fan formation across the ice tongues, lolling breath, steaming eyes bright as stars. With these dogs, a family's entire world could be transported, food, children, tools, even the elderly bundled onto sleds. The sled itself was a marvel. Crafted from driftwood, rare and precious bones, or later imported timbers, it wasn't rigid like European wagons. Instead, it flexed, lashed together with rawhide thongs that allowed it to absorb the shocks of rough ice and snow ridges. A stiff sled would snap in half. A flexible one bent and bounced, surviving where no wheels ever could. Steering wasn't by reins, but by voice and whip the musher, guiding with shouts, some sharp, some coaxing, a language only the dogs and driver truly understood. Travel by sled meant survival on a grander scale. No longer were families limited to what could be carried on backs or dragged on small hand sleds. With dog power, hunters could chase herds, further reach seasonal camps, faster haul whale meat across miles of ice. Entire villages could relocate more easily when resources shifted. In the endless chess game of Arctic survival, sled dogs gave the Inuit more pieces to play with. But dogs weren't just engines. They were also warning systems. At night, tethered outside, they barked at approaching polar bears, their voices a perimeter alarm. In blizzards, they could sniff out old camps or find buried caches of food. They even warned sleeping hunters, though not in cozy storybook snuggles, but by simply existing, their bodies radiating heat into the frigid air. To lose your dogs was to lose your mobility, your defenses, your hunting edge. Which is why the bond between human and dog, though not sentimental in modern pet owner terms, was deeply respected. These animals weren't property, they were lifelines. Now picture the flip side of Inuit mobility, the kayak. If sled dogs were engines of the land, kayaks were arrows of the sea. Sleek, light, and unbelievably maneuverable kayaks were masterpieces of engineering, perfectly suited for Arctic waters. A kayak wasn't bought at a store, it was built by hand, customized to its paddler. Driftwood ribs carefully bent and lashed formed the skeleton. Seal skins, sewn with waterproof stitches, stretched over the frame, making a hull so tight that it could slip across waves without a drop seeping in. Every line was calculated too wide, and it dragged too narrow, and it flipped. The result was a boat that could be carried by one man, launched by one man, and paddled into the hunt like an extension of his body. Now, add the spray skirt, a piece of ingenious tailoring. Hunters wore parkas whose bottoms could be tied to the kayak's cockpit, sealing the human to the boat. Water couldn't enter, even in choppy seas. A hunter could roll his kayak after capsizing, flipping upright again, with a twist of the paddle dripping, but safe. European sailors, centuries later, would gape at this trick as if it were magic. To the Inuit, it was simply Tuesday. With kayaks, hunters became apex predators of the sea. They could stalk seals basking on floes, dart toward walrus, or most impressively strike at whales as part of a coordinated crew. Picture a lone hunter gliding silently across water, the kayak's low silhouette almost invisible against ice. He edges closer to a seal. The harpoon rests balanced across the cockpit. A flick of the wrist, a thrum of sinew line, and the seal is tethered. The boat rocks as the hunter hauls it in every motion, practiced, refined, and respectful. Then there was the umiak, the kayak's bigger sibling. These were the family vans of the Arctic seas, open boats up to 12 meters long, also framed in wood or bone and covered with hides. Women often paddled them, carrying families, dog supplies, or entire camps across fjords and bays. Where the kayak was precision, the umiak was power slower, but capable of carrying a village's worth of belongings. Together, kayaks and umiaks gave the Inuit command over both land and sea. Few cultures in history have had such elegant dual systems of transport, each so perfectly tuned to its environment. Let's pause to consider something. Every piece of this technology, the sled, the kayak, the umiak, was built from scarcity. No forests of lumber, no forges of steel, no hardware stores. Just driftwood bones, skins, sinew, and endless creativity. Imagine the patience of sewing seams and waterproof stitches, each thread made of animal sinew, each hole poked by bone needle. Or the cleverness of designing a sled that bends instead of breaks. It's a reminder that human ingenuity doesn't need abundance to thrive. Sometimes it shines brightest in scarcity. And these technologies weren't just practical, they were cultural. A sled team wasn't only transport, it was identity. A skilled dog driver was admired, his dogs envied. Kayaks weren't just boats, they were status symbols. The craftsmanship of a kayak said as much about its maker as the songs he sang or the hunts he won. And umiaks carried not just families, but histories, stories, songs, traditions traveling across the water with every stroke of the paddle. European explorers who first witnessed these technologies were astonished. They had ships, of course, and wagons, but here was something else, light, flexible, tuned to ice and water in ways European tools simply weren't. Some adopted Inuit ideas. Whalers borrowed harpoon designs, Arctic explorers used dog sleds, but they never matched the mastery. These technologies weren't isolated inventions. They were systems part of a worldview that said work with the land, not against it. Picture a scene then. The long Arctic dusk, a sled team streaking across snow, their paws kicking up powder, a hunter steering with practiced yells. At the shore, kayaks slide into the water hunters, vanishing into the waves, their boats blending with the horizon. Behind them, umiaks wait women, paddling in rhythm, the boat heavy with children and camp supplies. It is motion everywhere, humans and animals and boats, woven into a choreography of survival. To live in the Arctic was never to sit still. It was to move with the seasons, with the herds, with the ice. And the technologies of sled and kayak made that dance possible. These were not luxuries, they were lifelines. They turned the Arctic from a cage into a highway, from an isolation into a network. With dogs and boats, Inuit ancestors could cross distances that would terrify most of us, and they could do it with grace. And as we'll see, these tools were more than practical. They were part of the spirit of the people shaping stories, shaping art, shaping the very idea of what it meant to be Inuit. If tools and sleds and kayaks were the bones of Inuit survival, kinship was the blood that ran through it all. In a world where the land itself could kill you with a careless mistake, no one survived alone. Families weren't just biological ties, they were lifelines, safety nets stretched across the tundra, invisible threads binding people together in a vast and intricate weave. Picture a winter camp, several sod houses clustered together on a windswept coast, their entrances low tunnels facing away from the biting wind. Inside, each a lamp flickers, children curl up in furs, and voices carry softly through the dark. But outside, between the houses, something else exists, the ties of kinship. Aunties drifting from one home to another to check on babies, cousins sharing scraps of dried fish, elders visiting to trade stories. It wasn't just neighbors. It was family extended in every direction until the whole community felt like a single sprawling household. Inuit kinship worked differently than the neat family trees we scribble in modern genealogy software. It wasn't about rigid hierarchies or neat boxes. It was flexible, bilateral, flowing through both mothers' and fathers' sides equally. A child belonged not to one branch, but to the whole forest. Your uncle's wife was as much your family as your blood sister. And within that system, everyone knew their responsibilities, who would share food, who would take care of orphans, who would mediate disputes. Survival depended on it. One of the most fascinating traditions was naming. When a child was born, names weren't chosen at random or invented on a whim. They were inherited often from a recently deceased relative, and with the name came a piece of the person's soul. Imagine a newborn given the name of a beloved grandfather. From that moment, people might address the baby as grandfather, treating him with a mix of respect and affection, as though the ancestor lived again in his tiny body. Names carried spiritual weight, bridging the gap between the living and the dead. It wasn't just remembering someone, it was keeping them present, woven into daily life. This practice had a powerful psychological effect. It erased the hard edges of death. When someone passed away, they weren't gone forever. They could return in a child's name, in their mannerisms, even in the way people addressed them. The community carried its ancestors forward, not through monuments or graves, but through language, through the act of calling and being called. Every time you shouted your child's name across the snow, you were also calling out to the past. Kinship extended to the way people handled conflict. Without prisons, courts, or police disputes had to be solved within the web of family. Arguments over hunting rights, jealousy in marriages, or slights in honor could be dangerous. Tension in a small camp could tear the fabric apart. And so, Inuit culture developed rituals of reconciliation. Sometimes this meant public contests, like song duels, where two rivals stood before the camp trading mocking verses until laughter replaced anger. Other times, it meant elders stepping in as mediators, their authority rooted not in law, but in respect. The goal wasn't punishment, it was balance. Because in a world where every pair of hands was needed, you couldn't afford to exile someone over grudges. You had to knit the weave tighter, not tear it. This web of kinship also dictated generosity. If you had meat, you shared it. Not because you were especially charitable, but because someday the roles would reverse. A hunter who hoarded his catch might feed his family today, but when illness or bad luck struck, no one would help him tomorrow. Sharing wasn't altruism, it was insurance, a social contract enforced not by law, but by need. And the remarkable thing is how well it worked. Archaeological evidence suggests that Inuit survival wasn't just about tools, but about this ethic of reciprocity. A village where food moved freely between households was a village that could withstand famine, blizzards, and bad hunting seasons. Kinship also shaped roles and responsibilities. Gender lines existed, yes, but they weren't rigid prisons. Men typically hunted large animals, while women mastered the equally vital arts of sewing, lamp tending, and food preparation. But roles could bend. A skilled seamstress could hold enormous influence because without waterproof clothing, hunters froze. And widows or women left without male partners often became formidable hunters themselves. The system was practical, not dogmatic. Everyone contributed. Everyone mattered. And then there were the children. Childhood in the Arctic wasn't the bleak, joyless existence outsiders sometimes imagine. Children were treasured, doted on, but also integrated into work early. A toddler might be given a toy bow. A little girl, a tiny needle. Their play doubling as practice for adult skills. Games weren't just for amusement. They trained agility, patience, observation. A game of string figures in the lamplight taught fine motor skills that would later be used in sewing intricate stitches. A mock harpoon game taught hand-eye coordination. Even laughter was part of survival training. Elders, too, had honored roles. In societies where written records didn't exist, memory was a resource as crucial as meat or oil. Elders carried genealogies, stories, hunting knowledge, and spiritual practices in their heads. When they spoke, people listened not just out of respect, but out of necessity. To forget an elder's teaching might mean disaster on the ice. Imagine a grandfather pointing out the faint change in snow crystals that means a blizzard is coming. That single observation could save a hunting party. Elders were libraries, living archives of Arctic knowledge. And yet Inuit kinship wasn't all harmony. It carried its share of tension, jealousy, and competition. Marriages were sometimes arranged, sometimes flexible. Divorce could occur. Partnerships shifted. But the important thing was that the fabric bent without breaking. Where European societies leaned on rigid institutions, courts, lords, bishops, the Inuit leaned on the weave of family ties. It was softer, but in some ways stronger. Think of kinship as the invisible infrastructure of Inuit life, where we modern people rely on power grids, internet cables, and highways. They relied on cousins' names, sharing, and memory. When you needed help, you called on family. When you wanted to pass something down, you gave it to family. When you died, you returned through family. The weave never ended. It simply rewove itself each generation. Now picture yourself as an outsider stepping into such a world. To European explorers or traders, it might have looked like chaos. No chiefs issuing commands, no laws written down. But beneath that apparent looseness was a system honed over centuries, as finely tuned as a harpoon head. And in its way, it was more enduring than castles or kingdoms, because no matter what storms came, no matter what outsiders arrived, the weave of kinship could bend, adapt, and survive. So as lamps flickered in those winter houses, as names echoed across the snow, as children giggled over string games, and elders retold the same legends for the 100th time, the true foundation of Inuit life was not bone or hide or snow. It was people bound together in a fabric strong enough to outlast blizzards, famines, and even the rise and fall of foreign empires. Imagine the Arctic night, the stars wheeling overhead, the wind whispering against the snow, the aurora bending and rippling in colors that looked too strange to be real. To the Inuit, this wasn't just scenery. It was alive. Every gust of wind, every ripple of ice, every breath of an animal carried a spirit, a presence, an invisible companion in the struggle of survival. To live in such a place was to walk through a world crowded with unseen neighbors. And to navigate that invisible world, you needed guides, shamans, known as Angakwit. The word Angakuk doesn't quite fit the mold of priest or sorcerer. These were people chosen sometimes reluctantly because they could see beyond the ordinary. They mediated between the human world and the spirit world, negotiating with beings who controlled the animals, the weather, the fortunes of hunts. If a hunter failed too often, if storms swallowed boats, if illness stalked the camp, the Angakuk was called. He, or sometimes, she was expected to find out why. Now, picture a ceremony. The sod house is dim, the lamp flame trembling the air heavy with the smell of oil and hides. Families sit quietly. Children hush their eyes wide. At the center sits the Angakuk eyes, closed drum in hand. The drum is more than an instrument, it's a vehicle. As it beats slow at first, then faster, the Angakuk begins to sway, chanting in tones that shift from human to something other. His breathing changes, the rhythm quickens, and suddenly his voice seems to carry more than one speaker. In that moment, the community believes he has crossed over. He is speaking with spirits, with animal masters, with forces far larger than himself. The Inuit believed that animals, too, had souls, Inua, each seal, each bear, each caribou, carrying its own essence. Hunt without respect, waste too much, or break taboos, and the animal masters would turn their backs. No seals at the breathing holes, no whales in the bays. The Angakuk's role was to mediate this balance, to uncover offenses, to plead on behalf of the people. Sometimes the cause of misfortune was said to be a broken taboo, Perhaps a woman rinsed clothing at the wrong time, or someone neglected a ritual after killing a seal. The Angakuk would reveal it, the community would correct it, and balance hopefully was restored. One of the most powerful spirit figures was Sedna, the mistress of sea animals. In stories, she is sometimes a maiden betrayed by her father, cast into the ocean, where her fingers cut off, as she clung to the kayak, became the seals, whales, and walruses. Angakwit told of diving down to comb Sedna's hair, soothing her anger so she would release the animals to hunters again. Imagine the drama of that tale told in a lamplit house, the ocean's goddess sulking in her undersea hall, her hair tangled and furious with holding food until placated. Through Sedna, the Inuit explained not only abundance and famine, but also the delicate relationship between respect and survival. The Angakwit were healers too. Illness wasn't seen purely as a physical thing. It could be caused by angry spirits, by violated taboos, by soul loss. A healer might suck at a wound to extract a spirit object, or chant over a sick child, or call for helping spirits to intervene. To modern ears, it sounds mystical, but in communities with no hospitals, no antibiotics, no pharmacies, healing required imagination, ritual, and faith. Sometimes the very act of gathering, chanting, and believing provided comfort and strength. Yet being an Angakuk was not a comfortable job. It carried responsibility and danger. A failed ritual could mean blame. A wrong vision could erode trust. Some shamans were revered, others feared. Power always attracts suspicion. The community might rely on an Angakuk, but also whisper about him behind his back, wondering if he wielded his spirits for personal grudges. It was a role balanced on a knife's edge, honored, necessary, but also fraught with danger. And the spirit world was not gentle. Inuit cosmology was filled with beings both helpful and terrifying. There were animal masters who gifted hunts, but also malevolent figures lurking at the edge of vision. Tiny, shadowy creatures who could cause illness, giants who roamed the tundra, spirits who lived in rocks, lakes, and storms. The universe was alive, unpredictable, and full of rules that humans had to respect. The Angakuk was the interpreter of that rulebook. What's remarkable is how practical these beliefs were. If you treat animals with respect, you avoid overhunting and waste. If you follow taboos about food and cleanliness, you maintain hygiene in fragile conditions. If you resolve conflict through ritual rather than violence, you protect fragile communities. Spiritual belief doubled as social and ecological regulation, enforced not by chiefs or soldiers, but by the very spirits people feared. It wasn't all solemnity, though. Oral traditions are sprinkled with humor, with trickster figures, with spirits who were powerful, but also ridiculous. Some stories describe encounters with beings who behaved foolishly, teaching lessons about humility. Even the Angakuk's trances, dramatic as they were, could involve playful theatrics, mimicking animal cries, making eerie sounds to amuse and terrify children, keeping everyone engaged in the ritual. The spirit world wasn't only terrifying, it was also a stage where wonder and entertainment lived side by side. European missionaries later tried to stamp this out, labeling shamans as heathens or devil worshippers. But the imprint of the Angakwit didn't vanish. Even today, Inuit art and storytelling carry echoes of shapeshifters, animal spirits, and the undersea goddess. The world may have grown modern, but those old rhythms of drum and chant still beat faintly, like a heart under layers of snow. Imagine being there then. The storm, outside rattling the walls, the lamp's glow, flickering, the Angakuk's drum, vibrating through the floor. You feel the hairs on your arms rise not from cold, but from awe. The chant grows louder, and for a moment, you believe you hear something else. A second voice, deep and strange, woven into the shaman's song. Whether spirit or performance, the effect is the same. The community is reminded that they are not alone, that the world around them is alive, watching, responding. That was the gift of the Angaquit, not just communication with spirits, but reassurance. Reassurance that the hunt wasn't random, that storms weren't meaningless, that illness could be explained, faced, sometimes healed. In a world of endless uncertainty, they offered a thread of order, however fragile. So as you drift tonight in your own bed, think of that drumbeat echoing in a sod house centuries ago. Boom, boom, boom. A rhythm steady as a heartbeat, carrying voices into the unseen. The wind outside may howl, the sea may rage, but within the people know they are part of something larger. A world woven with spirits, balanced by respect and guarded by those who dare to walk between. The Arctic winter is long. Imagine weeks when the sun never rises, only a faint blue glow, brushing the horizon before vanishing again. Outside, the snow groans under the wind dogs, curl into tight balls, and the world is locked in silence. Inside, though, inside a sod house or a snow dome, the air hums with voices. Because when the hunt is over and the lamp is trimmed, when hands are too tired to sew another stitch, the Inuit turn to their greatest tool of survival after the harpoon and sled storytelling. The long nights were made for it. Picture a room lit by a soapstone lamp, shadows dancing on curved walls, the faint scent of seal oil thick in the air. Children lean forward wide-eyed, while elders lean back, their voices weaving tales that stretch back generations. Stories were entertainment, yes, but they were also education, memory, and law, all wrapped into one. In a culture without books or written records, the spoken word was the archive, the university, the moral compass. And these weren't droning lectures. Inuit storytelling was alive. A teller shifted voices, mimicked animals, paused for suspense, made the audience laugh, shiver, or gasp. The stories themselves were rich tapestries of myth, history, humor, and warning. Some could only be told in the winter darkness. Why? Because certain tales, especially those about spirits and transformations, were believed to come alive if spoken in the summer. Imagine that a belief that words had such power they could summon what they described. In winter, the world was already cloaked in spirit, so it was safe. In summer, when the animals were plentiful and the land alive with growth, the stories were tucked away like tools in a chest waiting for the right season to return. Among the most famous figures were the tricksters, clever, mischievous beings who bent rules sometimes for survival, sometimes just for fun. They reminded listeners that even in a world bound by taboos and spirits, humor and cunning had their place. Tricksters made mistakes too, teaching children that cleverness without wisdom could backfire. Picture a group of kids giggling as an elder mimics a bungling spirit who tries to steal food but gets stuck in his own trap. The laughter warms the room as much as the lamp flame. Other stories carried stern lessons, tales of hunters who disrespected seals and were punished with hunger. Stories of greedy men who refused to share meat and found themselves abandoned. Legends of women who ignored taboos and brought storms upon their families. These weren't bedtime scoldings. They were survival codes wrapped in narrative. A child who grew up hearing such stories internalized them as deeply as any law carved in stone. And because they were told with drama and suspense, they stuck in the mind like hooks. But there were softer stories too. Stories of heroes and journeys of lovers crossing ice fields, of children adopted by animals. Inuit cosmology blurred the line between human and non-human. A person might become a bird. A bear might speak. A fox might marry a woman. Transformation was always possible, reminding listeners that the world was fluid, alive, and demanding respect. And then there were the creation stories: how the land formed, how the animals came to be, how the stars appeared. One tale speaks of the sun and moon as siblings chasing each other across the sky. Another tells of giants shaping landscapes with their enormous footprints. These stories explained what the eye could see, but in ways that tied the cosmos back to daily life. For the Inuit, the stars weren't just lights. They were companions, relatives, guides. The oral tradition also preserved history. Through stories, listeners learned of migrations, of battles with the Tunit, of encounters with strangers. A story might tell of a man who hunted in a certain valley, subtly encoding geographic knowledge. Another might describe a famine long ago, warning what signs to watch for. Elders acted as both storytellers and librarians, curating the tales that carried knowledge across centuries. Imagine the responsibility knowing that if you forgot a story, a piece of your people's memory might vanish forever. Children, of course, adored the tales, but they weren't passive listeners. They interrupted with questions, laughed at familiar jokes, repeated phrases along with the teller. Storytelling was communal, a shared performance. The audience helped shape the rhythm, and in doing so, helped keep the words alive. Each winter night, the story became new again. And it wasn't all solemn. Sometimes the stories were downright bawdy, full of jokes about bodily functions or human foolishness. Humor was a way of disarming fear, of lightening the oppressive weight of endless night. Imagine sitting through a storm that rattled the walls only to burst into laughter at a ridiculous tale about a man outsmarted by his own sled dogs. Laughter was survival too. What's striking is how seamlessly the Inuit wove imagination and practicality. A myth about a woman who broke a taboo wasn't just a spooky tale. It was a mnemonic device, a way of embedding cultural rules into memory. A funny story about a clumsy spirit doubled as a reminder of hunting safety. A creation story about the stars doubled as a navigation aid. Knowledge wasn't written down. It was sung, acted, dramatized, until it became unforgettable. European visitors, centuries later, often misunderstood this, treating Inuit tales as quaint folklore. But to the Inuit, they were as serious as law, as binding as scripture. The difference is that law here didn't come in dusty tomes. It came in laughter gasps and the rise and fall of a storyteller's voice against the hum of the storm. So imagine tonight, drifting in the warmth of your own bed, that you are a child in one of those winter houses centuries ago. You hear the wind outside, but you're focused on the elder's voice, on the rhythm of words flowing like a drumbeat. Shadows flicker on the wall as the lamp burns low. The story has a hero, maybe a spirit, maybe a lesson tucked inside. You feel safe, you feel connected, and you feel the presence of generations stretching back through those same words. For the Inuit, this was not entertainment. This was the thread that tied past to present parents to children, humans to animals' life, to the unseen world. In the end, stories were not just told in the dark, they were lights themselves. Little lanterns of meaning keeping the night from swallowing everything. And in their glow, the Inuit carried knowledge, laughter, and hope across centuries of cold. When you live in a place where survival hinges on whether your boots keep out the cold or your parka keeps out the wind, you might think beauty is a luxury. But in Inuit culture, beauty and function were never separate things. A stitch could be both practical and graceful, a carving both a tool and a piece of art, a drum, both a musical instrument and a bridge to the spirit world. In a land with no marble quarries, no cathedrals, no golden palaces, the Inuit crafted a different kind of art that breathed through every piece of life. Let's start with clothing. Picture a parka, hand-stitched from caribou skin, its fur facing inward for insulation, outward for snow shedding. The hood edged with wolverine fur, which unlike many furs resists icing. Seams sealed so tightly that not a breath of Arctic wind could find its way through. To outsiders, it was just survival gear. But look closer, and you'd see designs, patterns, cut with care symmetry, in the arrangement of panels, decorative stitches along the hems. Women who were the master seamstresses often added little flourishes, a stripe of contrasting fur, a tassel of beads embroidery in geometric motifs. These weren't unnecessary embellishments. They were identity, pride, beauty blooming in function. When you walked across the snow in such clothing, you weren't only protected, you were recognized, admired. Your very survival became a canvas. Boots kamek were another masterpiece. Soft sealskin soles, flexible enough to feel the ground stitched to uppers of caribou or seal. Waterproofed by layers dried carefully after each use replaced season after season. A badly made boot could mean frostbite. A well-made one was life itself. But again, beauty crept in. Colored thread, beadwork, even playful flaps made boots more than footwear. They were a signature, the work of a particular hand, a visible reminder of someone's skill and care. And then there were the carvings. Imagine holding a small piece of walrus ivory in your hand, smooth and cool. Now picture an Inuit artist, perhaps, while resting between hunts, taking a tool and carving it into the shape of a seal. Its body curved, its whiskers etched with fine lines. The figure fits neatly into the palm, simple yet alive, as if it might slip back into the water at any moment. These carvings weren't idle doodles. They carried meaning, sometimes spiritual, sometimes playful, sometimes both. A hunter might carry one as a charm, a child might play with one as a toy, an elder might use one while telling a story. Art and life weren't separate compartments, they flowed together. Some carvings were abstract too. Transformation figures showing humans sprouting animal ears, or animals wearing human expressions. These hinted at the Inuit worldview, that boundaries were porous, that the spirit world allowed for shifting shapes. Looking at them, you feel the eerie sense that identity is not fixed, but fluid. It's art as philosophy rendered in ivory. Music was just as inseparable from survival. The Inuit drum kilot was a circular frame with a handle its skin stretched taut. It didn't just keep rhythm for dance. It called spirits, settled disputes, energized feasts. In a winter house, when the air was heavy and the darkness endless, the beat of the drum was like a heartbeat for the whole community. Imagine voices rising with it, chants and throat singing, weaving around the rhythm until the room trembled with sound. For children, it was entertainment. For shamans, it was a vehicle. For everyone, it was community. Throat singing, often performed by women, is one of the most mesmerizing Inuit arts. Two women face each other, lips almost touching, and exchange sounds, gasps, grunts, growls, melodic fragments, creating a pulsing rhythm that sounds half human, half elemental. The game ends when one bursts into laughter or loses rhythm. It's playful, competitive, musical, and spiritual all at once. If you've ever heard it, you know it feels less like a song and more like listening to the earth breathe. Even tools carried beauty. Harpoons, knives, fish, lures all might be etched with patterns, their handles smoothed into graceful curves. To an outsider, it might look like unnecessary ornamentation. To the maker, it was pride. When every object is handmade, every object becomes personal. Your scraper isn't just a scraper, it's your scraper, with your design a reflection of you. Play, too, carried artistry. Children's toys often mimicked adult tools and animals. Tiny sleds, miniature dolls dressed in fur-carved figures of bears and birds. These were practice and play, rolled into one teaching skills through delight. Picture a child pushing a small sled across the snow, imitating the grown men outside, or a girl sewing clothing for her doll, preparing for her future role as seamstress and caretaker. In their hands, play became both art and apprenticeship. If you look for large, enduring monuments, in Inuit culture, you won't find pyramids or palaces. What you'll find are Inuksut stone markers built on tundra ridges, standing like silent sentinels against the horizon. Some marked hunting grounds, some pointed to safe crossings, some stood as memorials. Each one was a sculpture, built from what was at hand, placed with care so it would endure. Standing before one today, you feel its presence not as decoration, but as message. We were here. We knew this land. We left a sign for you. Even art that stood outside was functional, guiding, instructing, connecting. European visitors, when they first encountered Inuit art, often dismissed it as primitive curiosities. But over time, many realized the depth of skill involved. That ivory figure of a seal wasn't crude. It captured the animal with more accuracy and vitality than some European sculptures of the same period. The clothing wasn't quaint. It was engineering so advanced that explorers copied it, often clumsily, to avoid freezing. Inuit art revealed a culture where beauty wasn't an extra. It was woven into the very fabric of survival. And perhaps that's the most striking lesson. In many societies, art and utility live on opposite sides of a line. Here, the line doesn't exist. Beauty is function. Function is beauty. To stitch a seam neatly is both to keep water out and to please the eye. To carve a spirit mask is both to entertain and to teach cosmology. To drum is both to celebrate and to commune with the unseen. There was no such thing as art for art's sake, but nor was there ever function without beauty. Everything balanced, everything intertwined. So imagine one long winter night sitting in a sod house. The lamp glows. A woman stitches a parka, her hands sure her stitches neat. A man carves a figure from ivory, humming as the shape emerges. Children play with dolls dressed in scraps of fur. An elder taps a drum, his voice deep and rhythmic. All around you is survival, but all around you is also beauty. In the Arctic, they were one and the same. If there is one creature that held the Inuit world together, it was the seal. To the untrained eye, seals might seem like simple animals, lazily basking on the ice, slipping into the water like slippery stones. But for Inuit families, seals were life itself. Their flesh fed the body. Their fat fueled the lamp. Their skins clothed the children. Their sinew stitched the seams. Their bones became tools. Imagine a people building not just survival, but an entire culture upon the back of a single species. That is the seal's story in the Arctic. There were many kinds: ringed seals, harp seals, bearded seals, each playing a role in the annual cycle. Ringed seals were the most common, and in some places, the most dependable. These animals lived their lives under the sea ice, surfacing through breathing holes they maintained all winter. For Inuit hunters, those holes became portals to survival. Picture a hunter crouched over the ice, his body wrapped in furs, motionless for hours in temperatures that could freeze spit before it hit the ground. He waits, harpoon-poised eyes fixed on a dark hole, then barely audible the sound of a seal's breath. In an instant, the harpoon strikes the line, whips out, and life continues for another day. This method, known as moliktuk, seal hole hunting, was an art of patience. A hunter might wait motionless until his legs went numb, his eyelashes crusted with frost. Children were trained early to sit still, to breathe quietly, to notice the faintest sign of movement. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. And when the strike succeeded, the reward was immense. Seal meat, roasted or boiled thick and rich filling bellies that had waited too long. The fat rendered into oil, poured into soapstone lamps that gave light and warmth through the endless night. Without that oil, homes would freeze, food would rot, darkness would swallow everything. A seal was never just a seal. It was sunfire and bread rolled into one. Spring brought another kind of hunt-basking seals. When the sun finally returned, seals hauled themselves out onto ice floes to rest. Hunters crept toward them, sometimes sliding belly down across the ice harpoon in hand, closing the gap inch by inch. Too fast, and the seal would vanish into water. Too slow, and the flow might shift or melt beneath them. Success required balance, patience, and nerve. Imagine your heart pounding as you inch closer, the seal lifting its head suspiciously, the silence so heavy you hear your own pulse. And then release strike a scramble, the flow stained red, and another family fed. But hunting was not just about skill. It was about respect. Inuit tradition held that seals had souls inua, and that they offered themselves to hunters who behaved with care. Wasting meat, neglecting rituals, or failing to return bones to the sea could anger the animal masters closing off future hunts. Hunters might place a drink of fresh water in a seal's mouth after killing it, a gesture of respect in return for its life. Children were taught early survival was not conquest, but relationship. Treat the seal well, and its kin would return. Treat it poorly, and you might starve. Seals provided more than meat and oil. Their skins, carefully scraped, stretched and sewn, became waterproof clothing. Boots, mittens, parkas, many were fashioned from seal hides, supple yet strong. Kayaks and umiaks were covered in them, stitched so tightly that no drop of icy water could seep through. Seal sinew, dried and split into fine strands, made the strongest sewing thread available, able to endure the stress of cold and wet that would snap ordinary fibers. Even bones and teeth became tools, scrapers' awls, ornaments. There was no waste. To waste was not only foolish, but taboo, a violation of the sacred balance. The role of the seal was so central that even the rhythm of the year followed it. Winter was for hole hunting, spring for basking hunts, summer for nets and spears along coasts, autumn for preparing skins and storing oil. Each season carried its own seal strategy, its own skills to teach children, its own rituals to observe. You could almost say the Inuit calendar wasn't marked by months, but by seal behavior. Of course, danger lurked in these hunts. A missed strike could mean weeks without food. A cracked patch of ice could swallow a hunter whole. A misjudged floe could drift out to sea, carrying the hunter with it. Seal hunting required not only patience, but courage, the kind of quiet courage born of necessity. And yet hunters still spoke of seals with affection. Seals were not feared. They were partners, givers of life, always present, always needed. European visitors often marveled or recoiled at the Inuit reliance on seals. Missionaries complained about the smell of oil lamps, explorers wrote of greasy meals. But many quickly learned that without adopting seal-based survival, they would die. Famous Arctic explorers who scoffed at Inuit ways often froze or starved. Those who listened learned to wear seal clothing, eat seal meat, and burn seal oil survived. The animal that seemed so alien to outsiders was in truth the Arctic's most generous gift. The spiritual weight of seals was reflected in art too. Carvings of seals, sometimes realistic, sometimes stylized, appear in ivory and bone across centuries. Some show seals, mid-swim bodies, curved gracefully as if still alive. Others merge seals with human figures, hinting at transformation and kinship. Even in play, Seals appeared children's toys, shaped like little seals, teaching them to value and recognize the animal that sustained their lives. Imagine then a winter night in a whalebone house. The lamp glows with seal oil, the walls warm against the blizzard. Children gnaw strips of dried seal meat, while mothers stitch boots from hides. Elders tell stories of Sedna, the undersea goddess, whose fingers became seals long ago. The room itself is a testament without seals. There would be no light, no warmth, no food, no story. The entire scene is powered by the lives of animals that breathe through holes in the ice. Inuit culture could survive without many things, without farming, without forests, without metal. But without seals, the entire system would unravel. They were the cornerstone of survival, the quiet whiskered foundation on which a people built their world. So next time you see a seal, whether in an aquarium, on a documentary, or perhaps basking on a northern shore, pause for a moment. Behind those round eyes lies a history of thousands of years, a partnership between species, and the story of how humans carved a life in the most forbidding place on Earth. If seals were the everyday bread and butter of Inuit life, then walruses and polar bears were the feasts, the dangerous high-stakes hunts that could bring glory, prestige, and enough resources to keep an entire camp secure. But these animals were not easily won. To face a walrus or a bear was to court peril, to test skill and nerve against some of the most formidable creatures on Earth. Let's start with the walrus. Imagine a vast, blubbery mountain of muscle, weighing a ton or more sprawled across an ice floe. Its tusks, each as long as your arm, curve upward, like ivory scimitars, capable of ripping open boats or skewering hunters. Walruses hauled out in herds, bellowing, jostling their sheer numbers, intimidating. But to an Inuit community, one walrus meant meat enough to fill bellies, for weeks hide enough for tough ropes, and lines fat enough to keep lamps burning bright. The risk was immense, but so was the reward. The hunt usually began from umiaks, those big open skin boats. Hunters would paddle quietly, approaching the herd on a floe. The walruses might look sluggish, but once startled, they could stampede, smashing through ice or overturning boats. A harpooner's strike had to be sure the toggling head, embedding under the skin, the line coiled and ready. The walrus, once struck, often thrashed with explosive power, diving under the ice, dragging the boat with it. Picture the crew clinging to the sides as the line tore taut, the water boiling with the animal's fury. To lose grip was to lose not just the walrus, but perhaps the boat and your life. On land, walrus hunts were no less dangerous. A wounded walrus could turn on hunters charging with tusks, lowered capable of crushing bones with a single blow. Stories passed down warn of careless men who underestimated these giants, their names remembered as lessons. Respect wasn't optional, it was survival. Each walrus was approached not only with skill, but with rituals, words of care, gestures of gratitude once the animal was taken. To waste a walrus, to treat it disrespectfully, was unthinkable. Then there were the polar bears, the kings of the ice. Unlike seals or even walruses, a bear might be hunting you. Imagine walking across windswept ice, the horizon white, in all directions, and suddenly noticing a faint movement, a shadow gliding closer, silent, patient. Polar bears are masters of stealth, able to stalk prey for miles. To hunt one was both peril and honor, a challenge reserved for the bravest. A polar bear's value was immense. Its thick pelt became bedding and clothing. Its meat, though sometimes stringy, could sustain families. Its fat rendered into fuel. But beyond utility, bear hunting carried prestige. To kill a bear was to prove not just skill, but courage, a rite of passage that elevated a hunter's standing in the community. The methods varied. Sometimes, Hunters used dogs to harry and distract the bear while they closed in with harpoons. Other times, they ambushed bears at seal holes, turning predator into prey. But whatever the strategy, the danger was constant. A bear could outrun a man, overpower a dog team, and with a single swipe kill. Hunters carried not only weapons, but prayers, taboos, and rituals, because courage alone wasn't enough. You needed the bear's spirit to agree. The spiritual dimension of bear hunting ran deep. Bears like seals and walruses were believed to have souls capable of vengeance or generosity. When a bear was killed, rituals followed. Its skull might be placed in a position of honor, its spirit addressed with respect. Hunters explained their actions, acknowledging the bear's gift of life. Children were taught that bears could hear human words even in death, so the right words had to be spoken. The hunt was never just an act of violence. It was a negotiation, a dialogue between human and animal. Stories reinforced this respect. Legends told of bears that walked like men of hunters, who married bear women of cubs, raised as human children. These tales blurred boundaries, teaching that humans and bears shared kinship. Killing a bear carelessly wasn't just cruel, it was like betraying a relative. Yet despite the reverence, the thrill of the hunt carried its own magnetism. Picture a young hunter, his first bear in sight, the dogs circling the older men watching. His heart hammers, his hands tighten on the harpoon shaft. The bear rears, roaring snow flying. In that moment, fear and pride twist together. If he strikes true, he steps into adulthood, his name gaining weight in camp. If he falters, he risks not only himself, but the dogs, the hunt, the lives of those who depend on him. Few moments in life carried so much gravity. Both walrus and bear hunts highlight a paradox of Inuit life, danger and necessity intertwined. Unlike farming or herding societies, where food could be cultivated with relative safety, Arctic hunting was a gamble. Each pursuit carried risk of death, but without it, communities would starve. And so courage was cultivated, not the reckless kind, but the steady, deliberate bravery of those who faced danger because they must, and who did so with ritual respect and humility. European explorers often marveled at Inuit hunts, though their diaries sometimes dripped with fear. To them, charging a walrus or a bear seemed madness. Yet many explorers borrowed Inuit techniques, relying on their expertise when desperation set in. The very animals they feared became the animals that saved them, thanks to Inuit knowledge. Think now of a night after a successful hunt. In the camp, lamps blaze brighter than usual, bellies are full, laughter spills from houses. The hunters, weary but proud, tell the story of the chase, the splash of the walrus, the roar of the bear, the moment of danger turned into triumph. Children listen wide-eyed, imagining themselves in those roles one day. The animals' spirits, honored and appeased, are believed to watch from the other side. Balance once again is restored. So much of Inuit life was about balance, courage and caution, danger and reward, respect and necessity. Walruses and bears embodied that balance in their most dramatic form. They were terrifying, magnificent, and essential. And the people who hunted them walked a narrow line between life and death, between predator and prey, between reverence and survival. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those hunts not as scenes of violence, but as scenes of awe. A walrus heaving its bulk into the sea, a bear's roar echoing across the ice, and hunters moving with quiet courage, their lives interwoven with those of the animals they pursued. For in the Arctic, every hunt was a story. Every story a lesson, and every lesson a reminder survival was never free, it was always earned. Not every Inuit hunt took place on the ice. Beyond the coasts, across the tundra and rolling hills, lived two animals that carried their own weight in the survival ledger, the caribou and the muskox. They weren't as sleek as seals, or as terrifying as polar bears, but to inland communities, and even to coastal ones, at the right time of year, they were treasures with antlers and shaggy hides. To hunt them was to chase the pulse of the land itself. Let's begin with the caribou. Imagine thousands of hooves drumming the tundra, a migration stretching as far as the eye could see, antlers bobbing like a moving forest. For Inuit families, this was both spectacle and opportunity. Caribou weren't just food. They were a one-stop shop for survival. Meat dried into jerky or cached for winter. Hides sewn into clothing, especially the soft, insulating winter parkas. Sinew turned into thread. Bones carved into tools. Antlers shaped into harpoon heads or sled parts. The caribou gave itself as completely as the seal, but on land rather than sea. Hunting caribou required strategy because these herds were wary and swift. One common method was the caribou drive. Hunters built lines of stone cairns, inuksut across the tundra, spaced just so. From a distance, caribou saw them as human figures and funneled toward the gaps. Families would coordinate guiding the animals into narrow valleys or toward lake shores where hunters waited with bows, arrows, or later rifles. Imagine standing silent as the herd thundered closer, the ground trembling under your boots, then loosing your arrow at the exact right moment. The air would fill with the smell of musk, the cries of the animals, the shouts of hunters. Success meant not one kill, but many a harvest for an entire community. Other times, hunters stalked small groups or individuals. A single caribou could still supply weeks of nourishment. Stalking across the tundra required knowing the wind, moving in silence, reading the faintest tracks. Children learned early to spot a tuft of fur caught on scrub, a line of hooves pressed into moss droppings still warm. Hunting was a family lesson plan written on the land itself. Caribou also carried spiritual weight. Like seals and whales, they were believed to have souls, and disrespect could anger the animal masters. Hunters followed taboos, never mocking the animal, never wasting parts, sometimes offering water to the spirit of a slain caribou. Caribou appeared in songs and dances, in carvings and costumes, their antlers echoing the idea of abundance and renewal. Now picture the muskox. Where caribou were swift and elusive, muskoxen were heavy, stubborn, and dangerous. They roamed in smaller herds, their shaggy coats hanging in long brown curtains, their horns sweeping low and sharp. When threatened, muskoxen didn't scatter like deer. They formed a circle, heads outward, calves, inside a living fortress of horns and rage. For predators, this was formidable. For hunters, it was a challenge. Approaching such a herd required both courage and cunning. Hunters might set dogs to harass the animals breaking their formation, or use coordinated feints to lure individuals away. Getting close enough with bows or spears was perilous. One wrong step, and a muskox charge could trample a man. But the reward was extraordinary. Muskox meat was rich, their hides thick and warm, their underwool kiviot so soft and insulating that it remains one of the warmest natural fibers known. To wrap yourself in kiviot was to carry the comfort of the tundra itself. Muskox hunts were remembered in stories often as tests of bravery. A successful kill brought pride not just because of the risk, but because it proved the hunter's skill against a beast built like a boulder. Even their very appearance seemed designed to intimidate: shoulders, humped heads, lowered eyes, glaring through shaggy hair. Yet as with every hunt, Inuit tradition emphasized respect. The muskox had offered itself. It deserved gratitude, ritual, and care in how its remains were treated. Inland hunting required mobility. And here sleds and dogs once again played a role. Families might travel hundreds of kilometers to intercept migrations, setting up temporary camps. Meat had to be processed on the spot, cut into strips, dried on racks, stored in caches protected from scavengers. Imagine a camp buzzing with activity, women scraping hides, children learning to slice meat, thin men sharpening tools for the next chase. The air smells of drying meat and wood smoke, while in the distance, caribou antlers glint like a mirage. Seasonality was everything. In summer, when rivers flowed and tundra bloomed, caribou were easier to find. In winter, muskox herds became vital. This rhythm meant Inuit families never sat still for long. They moved with the animals, becoming part of the same migration patterns. In a sense, the people followed the caribou, the way rivers follow valleys naturally, inevitably. European explorers often misunderstood this. To them, nomadism looked like aimless wandering. But for Inuit families, it was choreography, a dance with seasons, a synchronization with animals. The inland hunts proved that the Arctic wasn't barren. It was alive if you knew the steps. There's a lesson tucked in there too. Caribou and muskoxen didn't just feed bodies, they fed identities. To wear caribou fur was to declare your connection to the herd. To tell muskox stories was to remind your children of strength and unity. Animals weren't only resources, they were teachers' symbols, even relatives. The blurred line between human and non-human, already present in Inuit cosmology, ran right through these hunts. Picture now a winter feast after a muskox kill. The lamp burns brighter, the house warm with laughter. Elders tell stories of hunts past young hunters, listen with pride. Children sneak scraps of roasted meat. The bones of the muskox creak faintly as they settle outside their presence, still looming even in death. In that moment, the entire community is bound together, not just by what they eat, but by what they share, by the story of the hunt itself. And so, the inland hunts balance the sea hunts. Seals and whales defined coastal life, but caribou and muskoxen tied people to the land. Together, they completed the circle of survival, each animal filling gaps the other left. In the Arctic, abundance was never permanent, but by diversifying, by hunting land and sea, big and small, the Inuit built resilience. As you drift tonight, imagine those inland plains. The tundra rolls out in silence, dotted with caribou trails cut with the deep tracks of muskox herds. A hunter crouches in the brush bough, ready breath clouding in the air. In the distance, hooves thunderheads, lower horns gleam. The chase is about to begin, not just for food, but for the stories, the pride, and the balance that make survival possible. By the late 1400s and into the 1500s, the Arctic was no longer an untouched world, hidden behind walls of ice. Word had spread across Europe of a possible shortcut to Asia, a fabled Northwest Passage that might carry ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific without detouring around Africa. And so, sails began to appear on Arctic horizons, white triangles against blue sea. Strange intruders in waters where only kayaks and umiaks had glided before. For Inuit families, the first sight of Europeans must have been baffling. Imagine standing on a rocky shore, the wind tugging at your parka hood, when a towering wooden ship looms into view. Its masts groan, its sails snap, and men in odd clothing shout in languages you've never heard. They smell of tar salt and smoke. Their iron tools glint in the sun. They are not spirits or animals, but not quite familiar either. Outsiders had come, and with them change. One of the earliest and most infamous encounters came with Martin Frobisher, an English explorer who sailed into the Canadian Arctic in the 1570s. He was looking not for Inuit, but for gold, and if he could manage it, the Northwest Passage. Instead, he found a people who had long since mastered the very seas his ships struggled to navigate. Frobisher's men traded with the Inuit, at first offering trinkets and metal in exchange for furs and fish. But quickly, curiosity and mistrust turned to violence. Frobisher kidnapped several Inuit, intending to parade them back in England as curiosities. Most died soon after arrival, victims of disease and alienation. To the Inuit, the encounter must have seemed bewildering, even terrifying one moment, trading peacefully, the next snatched away across an ocean. Oral traditions still echo with stories of strangers who came and stole people away. These kidnappings weren't isolated. Other European voyages also seized Inuit men, women, and children, sometimes under the guise of study, sometimes simply to display them as oddities in royal courts. Imagine the horror of being taken from an Arctic bay, carried onto a wooden ship, and transported to London or Copenhagen, where curious crowds gawked at your clothing, your language, your very existence. For Europeans, it was exotic spectacle. For Inuit communities, it was trauma. Loved ones vanished into the sea, never to return. And yet contact wasn't entirely hostile. There were moments of genuine exchange. Inuit were quick to recognize the value of iron knives, nails. Even fragments of barrels were repurposed into harpoon tips, scrapers, and needles. To a people accustomed to chipping stone or shaping bone iron was almost miraculous. Harder, sharper, longer lasting. In return, Europeans received furs, meat, and above all, knowledge. They learned that without Inuit-style clothing, they would freeze. Without Inuit hunting methods, they would starve. In fact, many European expeditions that succeeded did so only by borrowing Inuit tools and techniques, though few ever admitted it in their reports. But alongside trade came the shadow of disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza illnesses, unknown in the Arctic, arrived with ships sometimes wiping out entire camps within weeks. To Inuit families, it must have felt like spirits had turned against them, unseen enemies stealing breath and life. Even when explorers meant no harm, they carried devastation in their blood. This invisible legacy of first contact left scars deeper than kidnappings or skirmishes. Still, the Inuit were not passive. They adapted quickly, incorporating European goods into their existing systems without abandoning their own knowledge. Iron blades were lashed to traditional harpoon shafts. Muskets, when they eventually appeared, were used alongside bows. Glass beads were sewn into fur clothing, adding new sparkle to age-old designs. The Inuit proved once again that survival meant flexibility, absorbing the useful, resisting the harmful, and always weaving the new into the old. Some encounters slid into myth. Oral stories describe meetings with pale-skinned strangers who came from the sea, sometimes remembered as helpful, sometimes as threatening. In some versions, these foreigners are confused with the Inuit or other shadowy peoples of the past. Memory in the Arctic is long, but it is also fluid, bending history into legend. For a child listening by the lamp, the difference between a European explorer and a giant from old stories might not matter. Both were others, both reminders that the Arctic was not empty, but full of visitors, some fleeting, some dangerous. The irony is thick. Europeans came chasing wealth and shortcuts to distant lands, imagining themselves as pioneers in uncharted waters. Yet they stumbled into a world where Inuit had already charted every flow, every bay, every migration path. To the Inuit, these foreigners weren't discoverers. They were simply latecomers, confused wanderers in a landscape already mapped by generations of hunters. And so the first chapter of Contact was written in a mixture of awe, violence, curiosity, and tragedy. Iron tools and glass beads found their way into Inuit homes. Captives vanished across the sea. Disease slipped through camps like an invisible hunter. And always the drumbeat of Inuit resilience continued. Families mourned, adapted, and moved forward, weaving these encounters into their stories. Picture then a winter night after such a meeting. In a sod house, elders speak in low tones of the strangers, how they looked, what they carried, what they did. Children listen wide-eyed, their imaginations blending fact and legend. Outside, the dogs stir the aurora flares, and the world returns to silence. The foreigners are gone for now, but their shadow lingers, a reminder that the Arctic was no longer entirely its own. This was only the beginning, because soon the sails on the horizon would become more frequent. Whalers, missionaries, traders, each wave leaving deeper marks. But those first encounters, messy and uncertain, set the stage. The Inuit had met the wider world, and though the cost was high, they would endure it, as they always had, with patience, adaptation, and memory. By the 1600s and 1700s, the sails on the Arctic horizon no longer belonged to explorers briefly probing unknown coasts. Now they belonged to whalers, fleets of wooden ships bristling with harpoons' barrels, and crews who came not for shortcuts to Asia, but for profit wrung from the bodies of whales. For the Inuit, these newcomers were a paradox, bringers of useful goods, but also disruptors of ancient rhythms. And trailing not far behind them came missionaries who sought not blubber, but souls. Picture a bay in summer. Icebergs drift lazily, birds wheel overhead, and a cluster of umiaks and kayaks hug the shore. Suddenly into this scene glides a massive European whaling ship, sails taut men shouting in languages unfamiliar. From its decks hang cutting tools lines and the stench of smoke and tar. To an Inuit hunter in his kayak, the contrast is dizzying, his craft light, nimble stitched from skins. Theirs towering wooden, bristling with iron. Both seek whales, but the scale could not be more different. The whalers came in pursuit of bowhead whales, whose blubber could be rendered into oil for lamps, and whose baleen was prized for everything from corsets to carriage springs. Their arrival flooded the Arctic with iron tools, knives, guns, pots, cloth, and trinkets. Inuit families quickly recognized the value. A single iron blade could replace weeks of labor-shaping stone. Guns offered new hunting options, though they brought risks of dependency. Trade became brisk, furs meat, and sometimes guiding services in exchange for tools and goods. The Arctic economy, once sealed within its own cycles, was now plugged into a global market. But whalers also brought alcohol, tobacco, and disease. Camps that had been self-sufficient for centuries now experienced sudden shifts. The lure of trade sometimes drew hunters away from traditional rhythms, while outbreaks of illness thinned villages. Where once a winter gathering was measured by laughter and drumbeats, now silence sometimes hung heavy, entire families lost to contagion. The same ships that delivered knives and pots also delivered heartbreak. And yet, Inuit resilience showed itself again. They didn't abandon their culture wholesale for European goods. Instead, they wove the new into the old. Iron harpoon heads lashed to traditional shafts. Cloth stitched into parkas alongside fur. Muskets used when powder was available, bows, and traps when it wasn't. The genius of Inuit adaptation lay not in surrender, but in flexibility. Take what helps, ignore what doesn't, and never forget the knowledge that had carried them this far. While whalers came for profit, missionaries came for souls. By the 1700s, Moravian missionaries in Greenland and Labrador established settlements determined to convert Inuit to Christianity. They built churches, schools, and communities structured around European ideals. To the missionaries, Inuit spirituality, Angakwit, animal souls. Sedna was heathen superstition to be stamped out. They offered instead hymns, scripture, and salvation. Imagine the dissonance of people whose spirituality was woven into every hunt, Every story now told that their beliefs were sinful. Children were taught to sing hymns instead of throat songs. Shamans were dismissed as frauds. Elders who once spoke with authority about spirits were told their knowledge was worthless. It was a cultural earthquake, shaking foundations that had stood for millennia. But conversion was not always a simple victory for the missionaries. Many Inuit adopted Christianity in public, while maintaining traditional practices in private. A hunter might attend Sunday service, then still offer fresh water to a seal's mouth in quiet respect. A child might memorize Bible verses at school, then come home to hear grandmother's tales of Sedna under the aurora. Adaptation worked here too, not rejection, but blending. The Inuit took what fit, and quietly kept what mattered most. Literacy was one enduring legacy. Missionaries taught Inuit to read and write, often in their own languages, using syllabic scripts. What began as a tool for spreading scripture became a tool for cultural survival. Stories that once lived only in memory could now be written, preserved, and later revived. Ironically, in trying to overwrite Inuit culture, missionaries gave them a new way to protect it. Still, the losses were real. Some traditions faded under missionary pressure, pushed into the shadows, or forgotten for generations. The old Angaquit were discredited, sometimes ridiculed. Spiritual dances and songs were banned. Alcohol introduced by whalers and tolerated by missionaries left scars that lingered. It was a time of both enrichment and erosion, a tide that carried gifts in one hand and took treasures with the other. Yet despite all this, Inuit identity endured. Families still told stories, by lamplight still stitched fur, with artistry still taught children the old ways, alongside the new hymns. Missionaries could not scrub the aurora from the sky, nor the seals from the sea, nor the deep respect woven into every hunt. The old worldview bent, but it did not break. Think of an evening in one of those mission settlements. A bell rings, for service voices rise in hymn, but later in the privacy of a home, the lamp glows with seal oil, and an elder quietly tells a child about the undersea goddess, about how the animals must be respected, about the rules that keep the world in balance. Two traditions coexist, not in harmony, not without conflict, but side by side, woven into the complex tapestry of survival. The arrival of whalers and missionaries marked a turning point. The Arctic was no longer isolated. It was plugged into global trade, global religion, global currents of change. But the Inuit, as they had always done, adapted. They learned to paddle between worlds, the umiak and the whaling ship, the drum and the hymn, the angakuk and the pastor. And in that balancing act, they preserved something vital, the ability to remain themselves even in the face of storms, not made of snow, but of strangers. By the 1800s, the sails on the horizon were no longer just the fleeting visits of whalers or the stern presence of missionaries. Now came a different kind of ship, bearing a flag with a crest and the authority of an empire. These were the traders of the Hudson's Bay Company, an organization so vast and enduring that it was often called the Company of Adventurers, though its adventurers were less swashbuckling heroes than accountants with muskets. To the Inuit, their arrival marked the beginning of a new age, one where the rhythms of hunting and migration would slowly bend toward the rhythms of trade. Imagine a wooden trading post rising on the tundra, a cluster of log buildings, smoke drifting from chimneys, a storehouse brimming with barrels, sacks, and crates. Outside, Inuit families gather with bundles of furs, fox pelts, caribou hides, sometimes seal skins. They wait to exchange these for goods that glint and clink: iron kettles, knives, rifles, blankets, beads, tea tobacco. It was a strange new marketplace, one where the very landscape seemed to pass through human hands, and be transformed into profit lines in a ledger thousands of miles away in London. The company's arrival shifted the Inuit economy in profound ways. For generations, survival had been shaped by seasonal hunts and the reciprocal sharing of food. Now, furs became currency, and the best hunters often found themselves pressed to trap more foxes or bring in more pelts, not just to feed their families, but to satisfy traders. A subtle change occurred. Instead of hunting solely for food and balance, people began hunting for trade. The land once viewed as an endless dialogue between humans and animals was increasingly filtered through the arithmetic of commerce. Credit systems deepened this dependency. A trader might extend goods on credit in winter powder, shot cloth, expecting repayment in furs come spring. If the animals were scarce, or if illness struck, families could find themselves in debt. And debt tied them to the post, ensuring they returned year after year. For some Inuit, this was an opportunity. Iron tools and rifles offered real advantages. For others, it was a trap shifting priorities away from traditional rhythms toward the demands of an external market. And yet, as always, Inuit adaptation showed its brilliance. Communities didn't simply abandon their culture to become fur farmers for the company. Instead, they blended the old with the new. A hunter might trap foxes for trade, but still share seal meat with neighbors. A woman might stitch imported beads into her caribou parka, adding sparkle to traditional designs. Trade goods became part of Inuit life, but they didn't erase the foundation. The Hudson's Bay posts also became nodes of contact. News flowed there, stories from distant lands, rumors of other indigenous peoples, whispers of European wars that felt impossibly far away. At the post, an Inuit hunter might meet a Cree trapper, a Scottish trader, a missionary, and a sailor from London, all within a single day. The Arctic, once seemingly isolated, was suddenly linked into a vast web of human connection. But these connections carried costs. Overhunting of fox and other animals for trade began to strain ecosystems. Epidemics carried on ships or through trading networks struck again and again, thinning communities already vulnerable. Alcohol spread further, sometimes destabilizing family life. And beneath it all, a new kind of authority crept in, the authority of the company itself. Its rules, its prices, its presence on the land created a subtle form of control, one that would only grow stronger in the centuries to follow. Picture an Inuit elder watching this unfold. He remembers when iron was rare, when every tool was chipped painstakingly from stone, when hunts followed the rhythms of seal and caribou. Now, his grandchildren wear beads from Europe, drink tea boiled in tin kettles, and chase foxes for pelts rather than seals for lamps. Perhaps he is impressed by the efficiency of rifles or grateful for the warmth of wool blankets. Perhaps he is uneasy, sensing a shift in the balance, a tug that pulls his people away from old paths. Both feelings could live in the same heart, admiration and worry. And yet life at the posts was not all grim. The gatherings could be lively, full of laughter, song, and exchange. For many Inuit, these posts became new centers of community, places to meet relatives from far-off camps, to share news, to trade not only goods, but stories. The Hudson's Bay era wasn't just commerce, it was also cultural crossroads, with Inuit voices shaping and reshaping the exchange. The company men, for their part, often underestimated the people they traded with. In their journals, they sometimes described Inuit as simple, eager for trinkets. But those same journals reveal who truly depended on whom. Without Inuit guides, clothing, and knowledge, company expeditions into the Arctic interior often failed. Without Inuit furs, the posts would stand empty. For all the power of London's shareholders, it was still the hunters on the tundra who made the system work. As the 19th century wore on the Hudson's Bay Company posts, became fixtures of the Arctic. They introduced new goods, new ideas, and new pressures reshaping Inuit life in ways both subtle and profound. They also foreshadowed what was coming, a century of deeper colonial presence, schools, government agents, and permanent settlements. But in this period, it was still a delicate balance, a dance of exchange, where Inuit agency remained strong, even as the weight of the outside world pressed harder against them. Imagine again the trading post, lamplight spilling from its windows onto the snow. Inside, barrels of tea and crates of guns line the walls. A trader sits with his ledger quill, scratching, while across the counter, an Inuit hunter lays down a stack of gleaming fox pelts. The exchange is brisk but layered with centuries of meaning. Behind the hunter stands his family, his community, his ancestors. Behind the trader stretches an empire of shareholders and ships. Two worlds meet in that flicker of lamplight, each reshaping the other in ways neither can fully see. The Hudson's Bay era was not the beginning of change, nor its end. It was a middle chapter 1, where the Inuit bent but did not break, where trade goods mingled with ancient skills, where the drum still beat under the aurora, even as rifles cracked across the tundra. A time of both loss and resilience, of dependence and defiance. And through it all, the Arctic remained itself, vast, cold, alive, demanding respect. By the late 19th and into the 20th century, the tides of outside influence no longer came only on ships with sails or company flags. Now they arrived as policies, institutions, and programs decisions made far away in capital cities, yet reaching deep into the snow houses and sod dwellings of the Arctic. For the Inuit, these years brought not just contact, but control. And with it came wounds that would echo through generations' disease-forced schooling and the trauma of cultural erasure. Let's begin with disease. For millennia, Inuit families faced danger from storms, starvation, and accidents. But epidemics, diseases like measles, influenza, tuberculosis, were something else entirely. They came silently riding on ships or carried by traders and missionaries. Communities with no immunity were devastated. Imagine an entire winter house where the lamp still burns, but the people inside lie fevered, coughing, unable to rise. Elders' knowledge keepers fell first, leaving gaps in memory that could never be filled. Children, too, were lost, their laughter silenced. Oral accounts described villages nearly emptied survivors, burying loved ones in frozen ground, or leaving them under cairns of stone. Tuberculosis, in particular, became a long shadow. By the mid-20th century, whole generations of Inuit children were taken south to sanatoriums, far from family and land. Many never returned, some died in distant hospitals, others lost touch with their communities. For parents left behind, it was as if children had been swallowed by the horizon. These were not just health crises. They were cultural crises, fracturing families and eroding the bonds of kinship that had always been the foundation of survival. And then came the schools. Residential schools, as they came to be known in Canada, and similar institutions elsewhere, were designed not merely to educate, but to assimilate. Governments and churches, working together, sought to transform Inuit children into copies of Southern settlers, stripping away language beliefs and traditions. The logic was chillingly simple: kill the Indian in the child. For Inuit children, this meant being taken from their families sometimes, by force placed in distant schools where Inuktitut was forbidden, where hair was cut, clothing replaced, and English or French drilled into them. Picture a child who grew up with the sound of dogs, barking, the taste of seal meat, the rhythm of drum songs. Suddenly, he is in a brick building hundreds of miles away, disciplined, for speaking his mother tongue, punished for remembering home. Teachers tell him his parents' ways are backward, his elders' stories are nonsense. He feels shame where once he felt pride. For many children, this was not just dislocation. It was trauma, loneliness wrapped in discipline, neglect, and sometimes outright abuse. The residential school system left scars that extended far beyond the classroom walls. Children returned home unable to speak with grandparents, their language eroded. Some returned with habits foreign to their communities, struggling to reintegrate. Others carried silence, never speaking of what they endured. And through it all, Inuit parents faced the anguish of separation, the helplessness of knowing their children were being reshaped far from their embrace. It was a severing of bonds that had held for thousands of years. Missionaries, too, doubled down in this era, pushing Christianity as the civilized faith. Angakwit, once respected as shamans and mediators, were dismissed as frauds or worse. Drums were silenced in some communities, throat singing discouraged. Where once a child learned by sitting beside elders, now learning was defined by classrooms, chalkboards, and textbooks imported from the South. The shift was not merely educational, it was existential. A culture rooted in oral memory, seasonal rhythms, and spiritual reciprocity was being told relentlessly that it was inferior. Yet even in the darkest times, the thread of resilience held. Some children, despite punishments, whispered Inuktitut to one another at night, keeping the language alive in secret. Some elders continued to tell stories in private, defying bands. Families resisted by passing knowledge, quietly teaching hunting, sewing, and respect for animals in whatever scraps of time they could reclaim. Inuit identity bent under pressure, but it did not snap. It is important to remember, too, that Inuit did not experience these schools as passive victims. There were acts of quiet rebellion, moments of resistance, voices that refused to be silenced. A child might sneak a drum song into a whispered hum. A seamstress might stitch traditional designs into modern garments. An elder might scold a missionary behind closed doors, even if he smiled in public. Resistance was often small, almost invisible, but it was real, and it kept the ember of culture alive. Still, the trauma rippled forward. Children raised in schools without parental warmth sometimes struggled to parent their own children later. Families fractured by disease and separation struggled to heal. Addiction, violence, and despair, often fueled by the very alcohol introduced by traders, crept into communities. These were not failures of Inuit character, as outsiders sometimes claimed, but the predictable wounds of systemic disruption. Imagine tearing threads from a finely woven blanket. The holes left behind are not the blanket's fault, but the violence of the hand that ripped them. And yet within the grief, there were sparks of resilience. Inuit leaders began to rise, challenging the policies that harmed their people. Survivors of residential schools, though burdened with trauma, carried the determination to ensure their children would not endure the same. Communities began slowly to reclaim language, to revive traditions once suppressed, to demand recognition of the wrongs committed. The era of schools and disease was not the end of Inuit culture, though it tried to be. It was another trial in a long history of survival against overwhelming odds. Picture now an evening in a mid-20th century Inuit community. A mother trims a lamp with oil still rendered from seal, though she now cooks tea in a tin kettle bought at the company post. Her child is away at a school far to the south, and she looks at the horizon as if she might will the child back. Beside her, an elder mutters an old story, half under his breath, as if afraid someone might hear. The wind howls outside, but the lamp glows fragile and steady. In that glow lies the endurance of a people, even in the face of policies designed to extinguish it. The story of schools, disease, and trauma is not easy to tell, and it is not easy to hear, but it is essential, because only by remembering the pain can we understand the resilience, the way Inuit families, though scarred, refused to let go of their identity. They endured the silence, the shame, the losses, and still held fast to the lamp that had always lit their way, their culture, their kinship, their respect for the land and its spirits. By the middle of the 20th century, the Arctic was no longer just a distant frontier in the imagination of traders, missionaries, and explorers. It had become a stage for global powers, each one peering northward with hungry eyes. World War II, and then the Cold War, pulled the Inuit world into new currents. Currents powered not by dogs and umiaks, but by radar airplanes and geopolitics. For a people who had always lived by the rhythm of the hunt, the sudden hum of engines and the rumble of bulldozers felt like a new kind of storm. During World War II, the Arctic acquired unexpected strategic importance. The northern seas became shipping routes, and Greenland became a stepping stone for transatlantic flights. American and Canadian military forces established weather stations and airfields, laying down gravel runways in places where only caribou had once trod. Imagine the shock one season. Your community looks out over empty tundra. The next, the horizon bristles with antennae towers and strange metal birds roaring overhead. Inuit families found themselves drawn into this war effort, whether they wished it or not. Some worked as guides, hunters, or laborers for military outposts. Others supplied meat and skins to soldiers who quickly realized that their own uniforms were laughably inadequate for Arctic life. The knowledge that had sustained Inuit for millennia was suddenly repurposed for global war. A soldier might learn to build an igloo from a local hunter, or to dress in layered skins rather than wool, because failure to adapt meant frostbite or worse. Once again, Inuit expertise proved essential in a world that had long underestimated them. When the Cold War dawned, the Arctic's importance only grew. Now it wasn't just shipping lanes, but missiles and bombers that obsessed the great powers. To Washington and Moscow, the Arctic was no longer remote. It was the shortest path between continents. Suddenly, Inuit homelands became the front line in a war of watchfulness. Radar stations sprouted across the tundra, part of the distant early warning line, the DW line, designed to spot Soviet bombers before they could reach North America. The construction of these sites was a spectacle of intrusion. Bulldozers tore across permafrost airstrips, scarred the land supply planes, buzzed constantly. For Inuit families who had lived in seasonal camps for generations, the noise pollution and sheer scale of it all must have felt surreal. Imagine standing by your dogs as a giant cargo plane drops crates from the sky, parachutes billowing foreign goods, raining onto a land that had once given everything slowly, carefully, season by season. The dew line brought jobs, and for many Inuit wages offered new opportunities. Young men who might once have spent their days hunting could now earn steady pay, hauling supplies, maintaining equipment, or even learning to operate new machines. Snowmobiles, radios, and rifles began to replace dogs, drums, and bows in daily life. With wages came consumer goods, canned food, store-bought clothes, record players. For the first time, many Inuit experienced the push and pull of wage labor, balancing it against traditional hunting life. Some welcomed the change. Others mourned the erosion of older rhythms. But the changes were not always benign. Military projects often displaced families, forcing relocations to make room for bases or testing sites. In some areas, Inuit were moved hundreds of kilometers away from their ancestral lands, their hunting grounds severed by lines drawn on maps in Ottawa or Washington. These relocations, often poorly planned, left communities struggling with famine, disease, and despair. The state viewed Inuit as pawns on a geopolitical chessboard. Inuit viewed it as betrayal. The Cold War also accelerated technological shifts. Snowmobiles, introduced in the mid-20th century, quickly replaced dog teams in many communities. At first, this seemed a marvel: faster travel, less care required than feeding a dog team. But snowmobiles needed gasoline spare parts mechanics. Dependency on outside supplies crept deeper, tethering hunters to southern markets in ways dogs never had. The soft pad of paws on snow gave way to the growl of engines. Some elders shook their heads, sensing that the trade-off was not as simple as it seemed. Radios and later televisions brought outside voices directly into Inuit homes. Suddenly, news from Europe, America, even far-off wars played in the background of meals, once filled with stories told by elders. This new flood of information both connected and distracted. On one hand, Inuit youth gained windows into worlds they had never seen. On the other, traditional stories began to compete with Western media for attention. It was yet another balancing act: old words beside new signals, drum beats beside static. And yet, as disruptive as these changes were, Inuit resilience endured. Many adapted to wage work while still hunting part-time, using paychecks to buy rifles or fuel for snowmobiles that carried them to seal holes and caribou trails. The lamp might be replaced by kerosene or electricity, but meals still centered on country food, seal whale caribou shared among families. Elders still told stories, even if a radio hummed in the corner. The fabric of culture stretched, but it did not tear. The geopolitical stage may have seen the Arctic as a frontier of defense, but for Inuit families, life remained local. Children still learned to sew and carve to read snow and ice. Hunters still crouched for hours at seal holes. The aurora still danced overhead, uncaring of radar towers. The outside world could roar in with bulldozers and antennas, but the land itself still demanded respect. Patience and knowledge, the old ways remained indispensable. Think of an Inuit elder in the 1950s, watching the DUW line rise. He sees strangers building towers, speaking into machines that crackle with voices from thousands of kilometers away. He shakes his head, but he also marvels. The world has come here, he thinks. But still, the seal will breathe, the caribou will migrate, and the children must learn the old ways. That double vision, seeing both the intrusion of the new and the endurance of the old, defined the Cold War era for the Inuit. And so the Arctic became global, its silence pierced by the hum of engines and the crackle of radios. But beneath it all, Inuit families still gathered under the aurora, still shared food, still carried their culture forward. The world arrived with war and radar, but the Inuit endured it as they had endured every storm, with adaptation, with patience, with resilience. By the mid-20th century, Inuit life had shifted dramatically. Snowmobiles growled where dogs once trotted, canned goods sat alongside seal meat. Radios hummed with voices from far away, and children were taken to schools that often punished them for speaking their own language. The world had arrived in the Arctic, and with it came control policies and pressures from governments in Ottawa, Washington, and Copenhagen. For centuries, the Inuit had adapted to storms of ice hunger and change. Now they faced a different storm, the politics of nation-states. At first, Inuit communities were often treated not as citizens with rights, but as wards of distant governments. Decisions about their lands, their education, their health care, and their hunting were made far away. Relocations were forced, families uprooted, and policies written without consultation. It was as if outsiders believed Inuit voices were whispers carried away by the wind. But those whispers grew louder. By the 1960s and 1970s, A new movement stirred what many now call the Inuit political awakening. Imagine a generation of Inuit youth, some educated in residential schools, others in newer community schools, realizing that they had to fight for their culture and rights in the language of politics, as well as in the language of drums and stories. They saw their parents' pain, their elders' grief, and they also saw opportunity, a world where Indigenous voices were finally beginning to be heard. Across the Arctic Inuit, leaders began to organize. In Canada, this took shape in groups like the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, founded in 1971. The name means Inuit United with Canada, and its mission was clear: to represent Inuit as a people, not as scattered voices. They spoke about land rights, about housing, about education that respected Inuit language and culture. They challenged the old idea that decisions about the Arctic could be made without Inuit at the table. In Alaska, the movement surged around land claims as well. For generations, oil companies had eyed the Arctic's underground riches, but when drilling projects loomed, Inuit leaders pushed back. The result was the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, a landmark agreement that returned millions of acres of land and nearly $1 billion in compensation to Alaska Natives, including the Inuit, known there as Inupiat and Yupik. The act was far from perfect, but it was a recognition at last that these lands were not empty frontiers, but living homelands. In Greenland, under Danish rule, Inuit voices also rose. By the late 20th century, pressure for autonomy led to the creation of Home Rule in 1979, granting Greenlandic Inuit greater control over their affairs. Later, this grew into self-government in 2009, a step closer to full independence. Imagine the pride of a Greenlandic elder watching her grandchildren learn not just Danish history, but Inuit history in schools that finally recognize their identity. Perhaps the most dramatic achievement of this awakening came in 1999 with the creation of Nunavut, a vast new territory carved from the eastern half of the Northwest Territories in Canada. Nunavut means our land, and its birth was the result of decades of negotiations, petitions, and activism by Inuit leaders. For the first time in modern history, Inuit had a homeland recognized in law with political power in their own hands. The capital Iqaluit became not just a city, but a symbol proof that Inuit voices could reshape maps. But this awakening was not only about land and governance. It was also about reclaiming culture. Schools began to teach Inuktitut. Again, elders were invited into classrooms. Drum dances and throat singing returned to public spaces. Broadcasting stations aired programs in Inuit languages, carrying stories and songs across the airwaves. Newspapers, radio shows, and later websites amplified voices once silenced. What had been dismissed as vanishing culture was now defiantly alive. The awakening was also about memory. Survivors of residential schools began to speak openly about their experiences, demanding recognition and justice. Their stories, long suppressed, poured into public hearings, truth commissions, and documentaries. For Inuit communities, telling the truth was both painful and healing, a way of taking back control of the narrative. No longer were they passive subjects in someone else's history. They were the authors of their own. This period also saw the rise of Inuit art and literature as tools of identity. Carvings, prints, and stories found their way into galleries and books, celebrated not as curiosities, but as expressions of a living culture. Inuit artists, writers, and performers became ambassadors, showing the world that Arctic life was not frozen in the past, but vibrant in the present. A soapstone carving of a dancing bear, or a print of hunters on the ice, carried with it not just beauty, but political statement. We are still here. Of course, the awakening was not without struggle. Poverty, overcrowded housing, food insecurity, and the lingering trauma of past policies did not vanish overnight. New challenges like climate change and resource extraction added fresh layers of complexity. But Inuit leaders now had a stronger platform from which to speak a seat at tables once closed to them. Picture a political meeting in Iqaluit in the 1980s. Around the table sit Inuit leaders, some in suits, some in parkas, their voices steady as they argue for land rights, for schools in Inuktitut, for the dignity of their people. Outside, children play in snowdrifts, dogs bark, and the aurora shimmers. The scene is both ancient and new Inuit, speaking with authority, not just in sod houses by lamplight, but in government halls, on microphones, in legal texts. This political awakening wasn't about abandoning tradition. It was about protecting it through new means. Where once survival meant building snow houses and harpoons, now it meant drafting agreements and passing legislation. The tools had changed, but the goal was the same: to endure, to adapt, to claim space in a world that often tried to erase them. And so by the dawn of the 21st century, Inuit across the Arctic stood on stronger ground. Their languages still faced threats, their communities still bore scars, but their voices rang louder than ever. They had shown the world and themselves that they were not relics of the past, but shapers of the future. Language is more than words. It is the taste of childhood, the cadence of lullabies, the rhythm of stories whispered in winter. For the Inuit language has always been a vessel carrying identity, knowledge, and worldview. When children were taken to residential schools, punished for speaking Inuktitut or Greenlandic, that vessel cracked. Generations risked losing their connection to ancestors, their ability to name the land, the ice, the animals, in ways that only their languages could. Yet in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something remarkable stirred a revival, powered by memory art and media. Imagine a classroom in Nunavut today. At the front, a teacher greets children in Inuktitut syllabics written across the board. The children reply shyly at first, then with more confidence. They practice words for snow, for caribou, for seal. Each word is not just vocabulary, it's a key to the worldview of their grandparents. This is revival in action, reclaiming a language once forbidden, turning it into a living, breathing part of the present. Inuit languages are rich in nuance. Outsiders often repeat the cliché that Inuit have hundreds of words for snow. That's a simplification, but the truth is more profound. Inuktitut, Inupiaq, Kalaallisut, and others encode observations of the environment with incredible precision. A single suffix or prefix can change meaning entirely, describing whether snow is drifting packed, crusted, or falling gently. These distinctions are not trivia, they are survival. Knowing the difference between snow you can cross and snow that will crack beneath you could mean the difference between life and death. To revive language is to revive this encyclopedic intimacy with the land. Print and broadcasting became powerful allies in this revival. By the mid-20th century, missionaries had already introduced writing systems, often syllabics. What began as a tool to spread Christianity evolved into a tool for cultural survival. Newspapers in Inuktitut appeared carrying not just news, but poetry, stories, and essays. Radio stations began broadcasting in Inuit languages, their voices carrying across tundra and sea ice. Imagine a hunter out on the land dogs, panting snow, crunching under sled runners. And from his radio comes a familiar voice speaking Inuktitut, connecting him to his community even miles away. Television followed, with Inuit Broadcasting Corporation in Canada, and similar outlets elsewhere producing programs not only in Inuit languages, but rooted in Inuit perspectives. Children's shows, cultural documentaries, even comedies, all in the voices of the people themselves. For young Inuit, turning on a TV and hearing their own language, spoken, was both ordinary and revolutionary. It said, "Your world matters. Your words belong here." Music also carried revival. Throat singing, once discouraged or banned by missionaries, began to resurface proudly. Women gathered face to face, again voices overlapping in gasps, growls, and laughter. Young performers mixed traditional sounds with modern beats, producing songs that traveled far beyond the Arctic, reaching global audiences. Each performance was more than art, it was reclamation stitching together broken threads. The revival extended into literature and film. Inuit writers published in both Inuktitut and English, weaving stories that balanced tradition and modernity. Filmmakers created works like Atanarjuat, The Fast Runner, the first feature film entirely in Inuktitut, which stunned international audiences with its beauty and power. Imagine sitting in a dark cinema in Paris or New York and suddenly hearing Inuktitut dialogue subtitles flickering below the story, unfolding entirely through Inuit eyes. It was both ancient and brand new, a milestone in showing the world that Inuit voices could carry themselves on global stages without translation or apology. Schools too transformed. Where once they silenced Inuit languages, many now actively teach them. Elders are invited into classrooms to share knowledge not as quaint curiosities, but as living teachers. Children learn to build igloos, to identify animal tracks, to recite traditional songs alongside algebra and science. Education slowly becomes not an erasure, but a blending where Inuit knowledge stands beside global knowledge. Of course, the revival faces challenges. Fluency among younger generations is uneven, and the pull of English, Danish, or French remains strong. Global media floods phones and laptops with content that often ignores Inuit culture. But revival is not about perfection. It's about persistence. Every child who learns a song, every elder who records a story, every text message sent in Inuktitut syllabics is another stitch in the repaired fabric. What makes this revival particularly powerful is its use of modern tools. Social media platforms buzz with Inuit language content memes, jokes, political posts. Apps teach vocabulary with playful quizzes. Podcasts tell stories in Inuit voices. Youth blend hip-hop with throat-singing post videos on TikTok, with Inuktitut captions proving that tradition isn't trapped in the past. It evolves, breathes, and dances into the present. And perhaps the most beautiful part of the revival is how it recenters dignity. For too long, Inuit children were made to feel ashamed of their language, told it was backward, useless. Today, hearing Inuktitut on the radio, seeing it on street signs, in Nunavut, reading it in school books, children learn pride instead of shame. A language once silenced is now spoken with confidence, its syllables ringing out like drums against the long night. Picture it then, an evening in Iqaluit. A family gathers around the television. On screen, an elder tells a story in Inuktitut subtitles running quietly below. Children watch captivated. The grandmother nods, pleased. Outside, the aurora swirls. Inside, voices in their own language fill the room warm and steady. This is survival not only of body, but of spirit. Revival is not a return to the past. It is the carrying of the past into the present and onward into the future. For thousands of years, Inuit knowledge was calibrated to a landscape that seemed eternal ice that froze when it should winds, that shifted with familiar patterns. Animals that migrated in dependable cycles. Hunters read snow crystals like books. Elders predicted weather from cloud shapes. Families knew when to pack up camps and follow herds. The Arctic was harsh, yes, but it was also steady, a partner in rhythm. Now, in the 21st century, that rhythm is breaking. The ice is melting. Imagine standing on the edge of a bay in late spring. A hunter expects solid ice thick enough for his sled and dogs. Instead, it is slush, riddled with cracks, unsafe to cross. Seal holes are fewer caribou trails, unpredictable. The old knowledge painstakingly honed across centuries suddenly feels less reliable. It is not that the knowledge was wrong. It is that the world itself has shifted beneath it. Climate change has rewritten the Arctic's rules, and Inuit communities, as always, are adapting. Sea ice, once the foundation of winter travel and hunting, is retreating earlier and forming later. This shortens the window for seal and polar bear. Hunting alters migration paths and makes traditional journeys more dangerous. Hunters speak of misjudging ice that looks solid, but collapses beneath them, of routes once trusted, now treacherous. Where dogs once trotted confidently, snowmobiles now hesitate. Survival has always required reading the land, but the script is smudged, the sentences rewritten mid-page. Caribou, too, are changing their patterns. Some herds that once thundered across the tundra in tens of thousands have dwindled dramatically. Calving grounds shift migration routes, alter leaving communities scrambling to find food where once it was predictable. Muskoxen face new parasites and diseases carried north by warmer climates. Even fish appear in unexpected places. Salmon venturing further north, cod thinning in waters where they once teemed. The Arctic is not emptying. It is rearranging itself in unfamiliar ways. For Inuit, these changes are not just statistics or news reports. They are lived reality. A missed hunt means a freezer empty a family without country food. Store-bought alternatives exist, but they are expensive, often unhealthy, and never carry the same cultural weight. Seal, whale, caribou. They are not just calories, they are identity. To lose access to them is to lose threads in the fabric of who the Inuit are. And yet, true to their history, Inuit are adapting. Hunters now combine traditional knowledge with modern tools, GPS to track shifting ice weather satellites to predict storms, radios to coordinate. Communities share information, more widely blending the wisdom of elders with the observations of youth who bring home data from school, as well as stories from the land. In many places, scientific researchers now collaborate with Inuit, recognizing that centuries of observation offer insights models cannot. The term Inuit Kaujimajatukanget. Inuit traditional knowledge has entered not just community meetings, but policy documents guiding decisions about wildlife land use and adaptation. Snowmobiles and modern gear play a role, but the core remains the same flexibility. Where caribou are fewer communities, focus more on fish. Where ice is thin, hunters shift to boats. Where storms come earlier, camps adjust their timing. The spirit of survival that carried Inuit ancestors across Beringia through Dorset winters and into Thule whale hunts continues to shape lives under the aurora today. At the same time, Inuit leaders have become global voices on climate change. From Iqaluit to Nuuk to Anchorage, Inuit representatives speak at United Nations gatherings, climate conferences, and international courts, reminding the world that for them, climate change is not an abstract future threat, but a present crisis. They tell stories of falling through ice, of empty seal holes, of starving caribou, of coastal erosion, swallowing homes. These testimonies give human faces to melting glaciers and shrinking ice sheets, urging action not just for polar bears on postcards, but for entire peoples whose homes rest on thawing permafrost. The melting also carries cultural risks. When younger hunters can't rely on traditional travel routes, they spend less time on the land, and with that fewer opportunities to learn from elders. Knowledge must be adapted, re-explained, sometimes reinvented. The fear is not only of losing food, but of losing wisdom. And yet elders and youth continue to walk together on the land, re-narrating, recalibrating, passing on what can be passed, adding new observations to the old. The story of Inuit knowledge is not ending. It is being rewritten for a changing world. Imagine then a spring hunt today. A hunter checks his GPS before stepping onto the ice, but he also studies the snow crystals the way his grandfather taught him. He carries a rifle, but also a harpoon head, carved in the old style, lashed to a shaft. His snowmobile growls, but he still speaks to his dogs as if they understand. When he strikes a seal, he places fresh water in its mouth, honoring the ancient respect. Tradition and modernity ride together on the sled, because in the Arctic, both are needed. Climate change is reshaping the Arctic faster than anywhere else on Earth. But if history tells us anything, it is that Inuit culture has always been a masterclass in adaptation. From microlith tools to kayaks, from whalebone houses to snowmobiles, from drum songs to TikTok videos, the Inuit have carried their identity through every storm by bending without breaking. The melting ice is another storm, immense, frightening, unpredictable, but it is not the first, and it will not be the last. So as you drift tonight, picture the Arctic, not as a dying land, but as a changing one. The ice cracks, yes, but children still laugh on sleds. The caribou herds shrink, but songs still rise in Inuktitut. The sea eats the coast, but stories still echo in warm houses under the aurora. The future may look uncertain, but then so did the past. And still, the Inuit endure patient, resilient, adapting once more to a world in flux. For thousands of years, Inuit survival depended on seal hunts, caribou drives, and the rhythm of the sea ice. Wealth was measured not in coins, but in full bellies, warm clothing, and the strength of kinship ties. But by the late 20th century, the modern world pressed harder. Governments encouraged wage labor corporations, sought minerals and oil beneath Arctic soil, and tourists arrived with cameras hungry for glimpses of the North. Suddenly, the Inuit world was threaded into global economies. Yet beneath the hum of mining trucks and the flash of tourist cameras, old values continued to anchor daily life. Let's start with resource extraction. The Arctic, long imagined by outsiders as barren, proved to be rich in minerals, nickel, zinc, iron, even oil and gas. Companies saw profit. Inuit saw both opportunity and danger. On one hand, mines brought jobs, wages, and a sense of economic independence. Young Inuit, who might once have spent their days on the land, now donned hard hats, operated heavy machinery, or worked in offices. Families used wages to buy snowmobiles, rifles, fuel, groceries, tools that eased survival. On the other hand, mines scarred landscapes, disrupted caribou migrations, and threatened the very environment Inuit culture depends on. Imagine the dilemma: a paycheck on one side, a herd of caribou vanishing on the other. Survival had never been simple. Now it was tangled in global markets. Tourism added another layer. Travelers from the south arrived eager to see polar bears, to ride sleds, to buy carvings and prints. Some Inuit embraced this turning art and guiding into income. Soapstone bears prints of hunters' beadwork on fur. These became not just cultural expressions, but commodities. A carving that once sat on a family shelf now traveled to Paris or New York, carrying Inuit identity far beyond the tundra. Tourists paid for sled rides, for performances of drum dances once nearly silenced. Here was another paradox. Traditions nearly stamped out by missionaries now re-emerged as attractions, both preserving and reshaping culture. Cooperatives became a uniquely Inuit solution. Across the Canadian Arctic communities formed co-ops to sell art, manage stores, and pool resources. Instead of wealth flowing south to shareholders, profits circled back into communities. A co-op store might sell both soda and seal oil lamps, a visual reminder of old and new economies side by side. Art co-ops in particular gave Inuit carvers and printmakers access to global markets while keeping creative control at home. A drawing of a hunter or a mythic creature could fetch thousands in southern galleries, but it was born from the hand of an Inuit artist, shaped by stories told in lamplight. At the same time, wage labor reshaped daily routines. Government offices, schools, and hospitals offered employment. Teachers, nurses, administrators. Roles once filled only by outsiders gradually became Inuit positions. This meant steady pay, but also schedules bound by clocks instead of migration patterns. A hunter could no longer follow caribou for weeks if he had to be at work Monday morning. Families learned to blend the two systems, hunting on weekends, fishing after work, balancing country food with store food. The paycheck became part of survival, but sharing meat with neighbors remained as important as ever. Food in particular highlights the tension. Imported groceries are expensive and often unhealthy. A box of cereal might cost 3 times more in Nunavut than in Toronto. A head of lettuce can cost as much as a day's wage. Country food seal fish, whale caribou, remains healthier and culturally richer. But hunting requires time, fuel, and equipment, all of which are tied to the wage economy. And so Inuit families balance a freezer stocked with caribou, alongside cans of soup, a feast with seal meat and tea served in tin mugs. Old values of sharing remain strong. Even if food comes partly from stores, the ethic that no one should go hungry continues. What's striking is how consistently Inuit values filter these new economies. Mining jobs are debated in terms of how they affect community well-being, not just wages. Tourism is weighed against cultural dignity, not just profits. Co-ops emphasize collective benefit over individual gain. The old ethic of reciprocity, that survival depends on sharing and balance, guides choices even when the tools are modern. Picture a meeting in a community hall. Around the table sit elders, hunters, young people with laptops, a mining company representative in a crisp suit. The discussion isn't just about jobs or money. It's about whether a proposed project will harm fish runs, whether the company will respect burial sites, whether profits will build housing or vanish south. Voices rise, stories are told, values invoked. It's negotiation, but it's also cultural continuity, decisions made not only for today's paycheck, but for tomorrow's children. Tourism, too, is filtered through values. An elder might demonstrate drum dancing for visitors, but afterward remind the audience that this was once sacred, not merely performance. A carver might sell a soapstone bear, but he carves it in the style his grandfather taught him, carrying tradition forward. In this way, old values ride alongside new markets, refusing to be discarded. Of course, challenges remain. Unemployment rates are often high, housing shortages severe, and reliance on southern imports creates vulnerabilities. Some young people feel torn between traditional hunting life and the demands of wage work. Others, though, find balance working in offices, by day hunting seals on weekends, posting throat-singing videos online at night. The blend is messy, but it is also creative, resilient. The phrase "new economies, old values" captures this balance perfectly. Money markets and modern tools are real and unavoidable, but beneath them, Inuit culture continues to prioritize kinship, sharing, respect for animals, and collective well-being. It is not capitalism unchecked, nor is it a return to some frozen past. It is adaptation, just as it has always been. So imagine an Arctic evening today. A family gathers around a kitchen table. On one side sits a plate of spaghetti from the store. On the other, strips of frozen caribou dipped in seal oil. A child scrolls TikTok on a phone, but in the background, her grandmother tells a story in Inuktitut. A father checks his paycheck from the mine, then plans a weekend fishing trip. The lamp burns electric now, not with seal oil, but the warmth of old values fills the room all the same. Survival continues, not in spite of change, but through it, guided by principles older than any mine, older than any paycheck. Every generation of Inuit has faced change, sometimes glacially slow, like the drift of sea ice, and sometimes sudden, like the crack of a calving glacier. The youth of today face both at once. They inherit the scars of residential schools and forced relocations, but they also hold smartphones that connect them instantly to the world. They carry ancestral names, but also Instagram handles. And out of this mix, something remarkable is happening. Inuit youth are speaking, singing, painting, posting, and leading with voices that reach far beyond the tundra. Art has always been a heartbeat of Inuit culture, from ivory carvings to drum songs, but in the hands of youth, it now pulses through new mediums. Walk into a community center in Nunavut, and you might find young people carving soapstone bears just as their grandparents did. But step online, and you'll also find Inuit graphic novels, digital art of Sedna glowing under neon auroras, or hip-hop beats layered with throat singing. Tradition is not only remembered, it's remixed. Throat singing, once nearly silenced by missionary bands, has become a global showcase. Young women post videos of themselves facing each other, trading gasps and growls, their laughter bubbling through when one breaks rhythm. These clips go viral, reaching millions of viewers who marvel at sounds that seem both ancient and futuristic. The performers smile, knowing that, with every share a practice nearly lost, is carried forward, strengthened by attention from audiences far beyond the Arctic. Inuit youth are also filmmakers, authors, and musicians shaping narratives on their own terms. Zacharias Kunuk's Atanarjuat. The fast runner paved the way for a generation of storytellers who realized that their lives and myths could dominate a screen, not just appear as background. Now, Inuit filmmakers create documentaries about climate change, short films about everyday humor, music videos blending traditional dress with modern swagger. Each one is a statement. We are not relics of the past. We are here now and speaking in our own voices. Social media, too, has become a stage. A teenager in Greenland might post TikToks about hunting trips mixing humor with pride. A young activist in Alaska tweets about climate justice connecting Inuit struggles with those of indigenous peoples worldwide. Instagram fills with images of sealskin parkas, beadwork, and Arctic landscapes hashtags, turning local traditions into global inspiration. The reach is astonishing. Once Inuit stories traveled by word of mouth across camps. Now they leap across oceans in seconds. And these voices are not just cultural, they are political. Youth leaders speak at United Nations conferences, at climate summits, at national parliaments. They remind the world that climate change is not theoretical in the Arctic. It is visible every day. Thinner, ice-hungrier polar bears shifting seasons. Their speeches blend the authority of science with the weight of lived experience rooted in stories from their elders. When they stand at a podium, they are not just individuals. They are the embodiment of generations who endured storms and silence now demanding to be heard. What makes these voices so powerful is their balance of pride and honesty. Inuit youth do not paint the Arctic only as a place of tradition and beauty. They also speak openly about the challenges, mental health struggles, suicide rates, addiction, the legacy of colonization. They refuse to hide the wounds. Instead, they transform vulnerability into strength. saying to the world we carry trauma, but we also carry resilience. Their art and activism are not separate. They are intertwined acts of healing. Consider, too, the way youth bridge worlds. A young person might wear earbuds pumping rap music while riding a snowmobile to a hunting camp. They might text friends in English and Inuktitut in the same sentence. They might use GPS to navigate but still heed an elder's warning about wind direction. In their lives, the so-called clash between tradition and modernity dissolves. Instead, it becomes a fusion, a dance between worlds that seems entirely natural to them. Community gatherings highlight this fusion. At a youth festival, you might hear a throat-singing duet, followed by a hip-hop performance, both cheered equally. You might see fashion shows, where sealskin boots strut alongside streetwear. Elders nod, approvingly, recognizing that what matters is not the form, but the spirit, the continuity of identity, however it is expressed. This generation is also globally connected. Inuit youth collaborate with Sami youth in Scandinavia, with Maori artists in New Zealand, with Native American activists in the US. They share struggles of land rights, cultural revival, and climate resilience. In each other, they see mirrors, allies, and inspiration. The Arctic is no longer remote. It is plugged into a worldwide network of indigenous resurgence. And yet, even amid global recognition, youth remain rooted. Ask them what matters most, and many will say, speaking Inuktitut, eating country food, spending time on the land. For all the hashtags and conference stages, the grounding force is still the same, the quiet dignity of the land, the rhythm of the hunt, the warmth of kinship. They know that to carry their culture forward, they must keep those roots alive. Picture it then, a teenager in Nunavut posting a TikTok of her family preparing seal meat, the video set to a beat she produced herself. Her friends laugh and comment, some from across the Arctic, others from faraway cities. Later, she sits with her grandmother sewing mittens, learning stitches that have been passed down for centuries. In one hand, she holds a needle threaded with sinew. In the other, a phone buzzing with likes. Both are tools of survival, both symbols of her identity. Youth art and global voices together. They are not just revival, but renewal. They show that Inuit culture is not frozen in time, but dynamic, inventive, resilient. The next generation is not waiting to inherit the Arctic. They are shaping it, singing it, and broadcasting it to the world. The Arctic night has always been long, but never empty. For millennia, lamps glowed in snow houses, children laughed in sod homes, drums pulsed in the dark, and hunters walked across ice guided by stars. The story of the Inuit is not one of fragility, but of endurance, creativity, and constant renewal. And tonight, as we close this journey, we stand beneath the same aurora that has shimmered above them for thousands of years, a curtain of light reminding us that resilience can be as beautiful as it is strong. Think back to where we began, small bands crossing Beringia, carrying tiny stone blades, crouching by seal holes in silence. They endured. Think of the Dorset, carving ivory spirits, building stone lamps that flickered through winters. They endured. The Thule, with their umiaks and sled dogs sweeping across the Arctic in one of history's great migrations, they endured. Through every storm, every scarcity, every encounter with outsiders, the thread of survival never snapped. It stretched, it frayed, but it always held. The Norse came and went, leaving churches to crumble on Greenland's coast, while Inuit families lit lamps and hunted seals, carrying on. Whalers scoured the seas, missionaries built chapels, traders tallied furs in ledgers, governments drew borders, but still Inuit children learned to sew, to hunt, to tell stories by lamplight. Even the traumas of disease schools and relocations, terrible and deep, did not erase identity. They wounded, yes, but they could not silence the drumbeat of memory. Today, that drumbeat continues in new forms. It hums in classrooms, where Inuktitut syllabics are written proudly on the board. It echoes in festivals, where youth mix throat singing with hip-hop. It rings in political chambers, where Inuit leaders speak for their land with authority. It even flashes on screens, where TikToks of hunting trips or beadwork go viral, carrying Arctic life to distant viewers who might never feel northern snow under their boots. The world watches, but more importantly, the Inuit speak for themselves in their own words. Resilience is not only about survival, it's about joy. Too often, outsiders paint the Arctic as bleak, its people stoic, grimly enduring. But step inside an Inuit home on a winter evening, and you hear laughter, teasing songs, the warmth of shared meals. Resilience lives in humor, in the way a community can make jokes, even in the middle of hardship. It lives in generosity, in the way a hunter shares seal meat with a neighbor before feeding himself. It lives in creativity, in the way every boot stitch, every carving, every song carries both function and beauty. This is resilience, not as grim determination, but as a vibrant living choice to celebrate life in a place that outsiders call barren. The aurora, always swirling overhead, has often been woven into stories, sometimes as the spirits of the dead, dancing, sometimes as guides, sometimes as playful lights meant to be respected. Tonight, imagine them as threads in a vast tapestry, green, purple, gold, weaving across the sky. Beneath them, Inuit lives flow, ancient, modern, intertwined. The lights shift, but the people remain adapting, as they always have. Climate change, globalization, political struggles. They are storms, yes, but Inuit have weathered storms before. The difference now is that their voices are heard further, their stories carried wider, their agency recognized in ways once denied. They are not relics in museums, not passive figures in explorers' journals. They are present, active, shaping futures. Close your eyes and picture it. A hunter on the ice GPS, clipped to his belt rifle on his sled, but still whispering a thank you to the seal he takes, still offering fresh water to its mouth. A grandmother, scrolling on her phone, smiling at a throat-singing video posted by her granddaughter, but still teaching her to sew boots by lamplight. A teenager in Greenland, speaking at the UN, tie around his neck, but his words echoing the values of sharing and respect that his ancestors lived by. Old and new, woven seamlessly, like sinew thread, binding skins tight against the cold. The Inuit story is not a tragedy. It is a story of adaptation, of endurance, of resilience under the aurora. From stone blades to snowmobiles, from lamplight to electric light, from oral stories to global media, the thread continues. And as long as children still laugh under northern skies, as long as elders still speak in Inuktitut, as long as hunters still whisper respect to the animals they take, the story will go on. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of that lamp glowing in the dark. Think of families gathered inside, while the wind howls outside. Think of the aurora, dancing, silent, and eternal. The Inuit have always found warmth in the cold light, in the dark community, in the vastness, and they always will.